The Shuttle Columbia accident and its impact on NASA's budget was the focus of a House Science Committee hearing today. The committee heard testimony from NASA Administrator Sean O'Keefe. It's about 3 hours.
I'm pleased to welcome everyone here today for our annual review of NASA's budget. As I think everyone knows, this hearing was scheduled before the loss of the Space Shuttle Columbia on February 1st. Still, that tragedy casts a pall over our proceedings today, both emotionally and substantively. The emotional impact is obvious, and I suppose the substantive ramifications are as well. It's simply impossible to get a clear fix at this point on how much the human space flight program will require in the upcoming fiscal year. That, of course, raises questions about the NASA budget as a whole. Still, we must begin to plan, and there are numerous relevant questions we need to ask today on topics other than the shuttle investigation or that program's budget. I should say, though, that having met with Admiral Gaiman at length yesterday, I am more convinced than ever that the Columbia Accident Investigation Board has the independence and resources it needs to conduct a broad, a thorough, and a useful investigation. The board does still need some additional members, and I expect that more will be appointed within the next week or so. I look forward to cooperating with Admiral Gaiman as the committee conducts its own bipartisan investigation. The Gaiman investigation could take as long as 6 months, although portions of it may be completed more quickly. And it's my understanding from Admiral Gaiman that there will be a phased release of the reports. As they get significant information, it will be released. But we have to assume that the shuttle may be grounded for an extended period. I understand that this morning Administrator O'Keefe will reveal how NASA intends to operate the International Space Station while the shuttle is out of commission. I look forward to being able to pursue any questions that plan may raise. Still, our primary focus this morning is on the FY04 budget submission, which itself raises a host of questions. I am particularly concerned that spending on aeronautics is slated to decline, even as the budget calls for healthy increases for the agency overall. I find this somewhat baffling at a time when the need for aeronautics research is so apparent. Unless we're going to rename NASA and call it N'(SA), I think the aeronautics budget needs to be rethought. I should add that while we will be holding additional hearings on aeronautics research at both NASA and the Federal Aviation Administration in the coming weeks, including a full committee hearing on March 12th with the members of the congressionally created Aerospace Commission that was chaired by one of my predecessors at the committee, Bob Walker. I also want to be sure, among other things, that Earth science research is getting its due. Earth science is a critical NASA mission of enormous scientific utility and vital to sorting out some key questions of practical as well as intellectual consequence, such as the nature of global climate change. And I know all of us here are interested in learning more about NASA's still conceptual plans for the orbital space plan. Obviously, research related to replacing the shuttle seems more pressing with every passing day. Finally, I know that Administrator O'Keefe today will highlight NASA's personnel needs, which have also been underscored in several General Accounting Office studies. I believe we must act swiftly to give NASA additional flexibility to recruit and retain employees. I've worked with NASA for several months to come up with legislation to do that, legislation that, quite frankly, we had hoped to include in the omnibus appropriations bill. For various procedural reasons, that path did not work, but I do intend to introduce a NASA personnel bill within the next week or so. So we have plenty to discuss this morning, and as always, I look forward to hearing from Administrator O'Keefe. As the Administrator knows, we will start with 10 minutes of testimony from him and then go through as many questions as we can until 11 a.m., when we'll break for about an hour or so members can attend an important briefing from Secretary Ridge. Then we'll resume for as long as we have to. Mr. Hall?
Mr. Chairman, thanks for your opening statement, and I think it was a good statement. I may not be as convinced as you are that we have the independent thrust that we need, and I think that's something that you've taken the lead on, and I appreciate that, and I think we need to continue to work together. You have been very good at working with us on this side. Certainly those staffers have been good. They've worked together. We want to fall in behind this administrator and circle the wagons and keep a good space station going, and I think try to go in one direction. I want to do that, and I've always wanted to do that, as long as you went in the direction that I wanted to go in. And I guess that hadn't changed a lot for any of us. But I welcome Administrator O'Keefe to today's hearing, and I know that the members wish we could hear about NASA's new budget request under happier circumstances, but we have to deal with the hand that's dealt us, and that's what we're doing. One of the committee's roles will be to understand the root causes of the Columbia accident and to put in safeguards to try to prevent such an accident from happening again. And I think we're looking for causation to protect the future more than we're looking for blame to curse the past. We've got to get together and we've got to go forward. I think this committee and the leadership of the chairman of this committee and leadership of over on this side, and particularly Mr. Garden, who chairs the Space Subcommittee, are going in the right direction. We met yesterday, as you did, with Admiral Gaiman, and he expressed the same determination, I think, that I've heard from almost everyone, to get the cause of the accident and to identify any contributing factors. This committee shouldn't shrink from asking any of the tough questions, and I don't believe we're going to do that, and questions of NASA and of ourselves to identify the proper corrective measure. Our next months, several months, we'll need to determine the impact of the Columbia accident on NASA's budget and programs. And today we're going to try to understand the rationale for some of the budgetary cuts and enhancements that are part of this request. For example, why is funding for aeronautics R&D cut over the next 5 years? Why is NASA's commercial technology program being terminated? And why does the shuttle upgrades budget continue to lag relative to the original plan, while important upgrades continue to be deferred? These are questions I think that we hope have answered today. And at the same time, the budget request finds room, I see, for some expensive new missions. A year after OMB canceled the $1 billion Europa orbiter mission because it was too expensive, NASA is now proposing to take a $4 billion mission to Jupiter's icy moons. 2 years after OMB deferred work on the $1.4 billion U.S. crew return vehicle for the international station, NASA is now proposing to spend what it estimates could be 10 times as much on the orbital space plane. The Columbia accident has reinforced the priority of astronaut safety, and I continue to be concerned that we have not more vigorously pursued Space Shuttle crew survivability systems in the 17 years since the Challenger accident, and I join the group that can stand there for some blame on that because I've been here those 17 years. Weight issues originally related to the need to be able to lift space station modules into orbit. That may not be relevant now that we're nearing the end of the space station assembly, and cost issues seem to be examined in the light of NASA's willingness to find money to undertake other expensive new initiatives. A lot of the same arguments apply to the U.S. crew return vehicle. The U.S. had a program to develop a U.S. CRV for the International Space Station. In fact, developing such a rescue vehicle is a U.S. responsibility under the international agreements governing the space station program. So those are things, and NASA said that the orbital space plane will supplement, not replace the space shuttle. We need to hear more about that. I don't believe I've used much over half of my time, Mr. Chairman. I want to yield the time I have remaining to the ranking member of the Space Committee. Mr. Gordon.
You have 13 seconds left, but
okay.
we will
Well, if there's
allow Mr. Gordon a couple of minutes, and we will also allow Mr. Rohrabacher a couple of minutes.
Well, in my 13 seconds, let me just commend our chairman for setting up a truly bipartisan, bicameral approach to the investigation and the process that this committee is going to take, and also for the proceedings that you've laid out today. If, in addition to that, you are giving me 2 extra moments, I will add my welcome to Administrator O'Keefe and commend you for the sensitivity that you and NASA have demonstrated in working with the families of the astronauts. I think you've done a good job. Let me also commend you on the changes that you have made to what I think was pretty well considered universally a flawed charter document for an independent commission. I think you've made some positive changes. The problem, though, I see is that if the barn door is broken, just by putting a few coats of paint on it, you don't fix the door. And I think we still have a broken door here. And I would hope that you would recommend to the President that he would follow the model, really, of Ronald Reagan in having both a truly independent commission in fact as well as in perception. And I think the way to do that at this point is to take any or all of the current members, have them appointed as a presidential commission, add to those members an equal number of additional members that have expertise, give them their own budget, and have them report to both the President and to Congress. And I would hope that again, in an effort to get this truly independent commission in both in fact as well as perception, that you would make that recommendation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rohrabacher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And yesterday when we met with Admiral Gaiman, I couldn't help but get a sinking feeling in my stomach when we saw this flight coming down of the shuttle, and the Admiral mentioned to us that the Columbia had actually gone through 75% of what it had to go through in reentry. It was almost all the way home, and they didn't quite make it. And they'd already gone through the hottest part of the reentry. They'd already gone through 75% of the time of danger time of reentry, and then we lost them right there at the minute. And just we lost our astronauts, but we have a second chance now to do something to make sure that we put NASA on the right track and to make sure that these lives were not lost in vain. And I think it's all up to all of us to take this very seriously, not just looking into what may or may not have happened, a mistake or a technical problem with the shuttle, but what we have to do with NASA to make sure it meets its potential in the future. And the shuttle, when it was first designed 30 years ago, it was a engineering marvel, but that was 30 years ago, and it's up to us now as a priority to find a cheaper and perhaps a safer way of getting into space to make sure that America remains the #1 space power on the planet. And I am looking forward to working with all of you on both sides of this aisle, and then with you, Mr. O'Keefe, to try to come down to exactly what happened with the Space Shuttle Columbia, but also in trying to make sure we move forward and putting America where we want it to put. And just one note: in order to do this, we really have to be very, very cautious with our numbers, and that's what we're talking about today, the budget. And Mr. Hall brought up a point that I thought was important about different plans in the past with Europa, for example, which was a very expensive space endeavor. I noticed in the budget, and I mentioned this to you before, that it seemed to be a rather expensive project going to the ice moon of Jupiter, and I noticed in the budget it's a $3 billion project, but that's only for the first 5 years, and it's not scheduled to go off for another 11 years, and I would wonder how much more money we're going to spend on that project. So when every dollar counts and people's lives are at stake, we're going to ask some of the tough questions today, and I appreciate Ralph for bringing up the issue and some of the other issues that Bart Gordon will also bring up as well. This is a bipartisan committee, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me my say.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rohrabacher, and I couldn't agree more with you that we have to learn from the past as we plan for the future. And as Mr. Gordon has observed, and Mr. Hall also, we have been working on a bipartisan basis to assure that the Columbia Accident Investigation Board is independent, in fact, not just in name. And one of the most comforting comments I received yesterday in a rather lengthy meeting with Admiral Gaiman was that, and I quote him exactly, "The board is completely independent and will remain that way." And I think that's very important, and I'm glad to see that the board will be expanded. I also was pleased by the Admiral's response to my question, "Who do you work for, Admiral?" And he said, "We work for several people. We work for the White House, we work for the Congress, we work for NASA, we work for the American people, but most of all, we're working for the families of the Columbia astronauts." That was the type of answer I was hoping for. Mr. O'Keefe, let me say to you that how very favorably impressed we are with the manner in which you and the NASA family have been so open with the American people in sharing information about this tragic day in the lives of our nation, indeed the world. We are all with you and working with you to assure that the job you have is made as easy as possible as we go forward together for a better day. With that, Administrator O'Keefe.
Activated here, sorry. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again for your very thoughtful statement to you and Congressman Hall, to the other members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before the committee today to discuss the President's fiscal year 2004 budget proposal of $15.5 billion for NASA. The President's request demonstrates the administration's continued confidence in NASA's ability to advance the nation's science and technology agenda. Let me first turn to a brief update, if you would, sir, on the Columbia accident investigation process that is underway at present. As you've all mentioned, the opportunity to have spent time with Admiral Gaiman yesterday. He's briefed several members of the committee, and again, I add nothing further to the commentary than that which has been very thoughtfully presented in the opening statements by so many members here. Other than to add that we are committed to letting the facts and the evidence guide the deliberations. We are cooperating fully with the Columbia Accident Investigation Board. Admiral Gaiman and I have agreed that there is absolutely no limit to the resource capabilities and issues that we have available to the agency or to the federal government for the purposes of finding the truth and determining exactly what happened in this horrific accident. In that regard, he has noted to me on several occasions, and I'm gratified to hear that he expressed that as well to members of the committee here, that the professionalism and openness that each member of the NASA family have demonstrated in this case is in pursuit of those facts, that evidence, and the truth of what happened. It is imperative we know the truth to determine what happened, because we owe that to the families, positively. We owe that to the American people, who have entrusted this very important portfolio of exploration and discovery to us. And we owe it to our international partners, who have participated so impressively, I think, in development of the International Space Station over the course of many years. We have also and understand that there are a range of issues that we have to continue to work to make the corrections once the Columbia Accident Investigation Board completes its deliberation, to make corrections and return to safe flight, that there is in this interim period, for however long that lasts, a requirement to continue to support the International Space Station. We have worked with our international partners, the 16 nations that we're all combined with, to develop this impressive capability of a laboratory and research capacity in space. And we've worked together to determine what that interim solution should be. And as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, as of yesterday, we were able to reach a very specific set of conclusions on that approach. Our deliberations have been very constructive, and all of the partners are acting like partners in the development of a partnership solution. So as of yesterday, the final or determination at this point in terms of how we proceed ahead is we've agreed to use the Russian Soyuz emergency egress spacecraft that are rotated twice a year to International Space Station to rotate the crew, the expedition crews aboard the International Space Station for this interim period. So the next flight that will be going up in April, end of April or early part of May, depending on the timing here, will be to bring back the current 3 members of the crew, Ken Bowersox, Don Pettit, and Nikolai Bodarin, at that time, and to bring up the crew of a Expedition 7 of 2 members, a U.S. astronaut and a Russian cosmonaut. Those crew members have been named, and they are training now in Star City, Russia, to maintain their proficiency on the Soyuz craft, and are continuing the operations, training, and other operational preparations to continue the permanent presence aboard the International Space Station. We've also established a manifest for the flights of the Soyuz spacecraft over the course of the next year. There'll be another flight in October, as had been planned, to rotate that emergency egress capacity that is permanently affixed to the International Space Station. And we've agreed to accelerate the flights of the Progress autonomous, not manned vehicles that bring up logistics, water, supplies, consumables to the International Space Station, as well as spares and other requirements that are aboard for continued operation of the International Space Station. We have agreed to a specific procedure to manifest only those mandatory elements which are required in order to maintain station, as well as continue a science and research objectives to the extent possible, given the space limitations on Progress vehicles as well as on the Soyuz. At a minimum, we have also agreed that an additional 2 Progress vehicles, 1 in 2003 and 1 in 2004, will be accelerated in order to support, at least for the next, for the foreseeable future, a capacity to support the International Space Station, at least for the next 18 months. It will again be a rotation of crews at the intervals in which the Soyuz vehicles are launched, which will occur again in October, and then again 6 months thereafter, as has always been planned for the rotation of that capacity. So the partnership has agreed to that. We are all in agreement on the approach on how we will proceed from this stage in order to maintain that capacity and to assure that we can operationally continue this important laboratory condition. Let me turn, if you would, Mr. Chairman, to just a couple of highlights on the budget and the topic of discussion primarily here for today. The budget, I would hope we will present and be convincing of, is a responsible position of our highest priorities. It is credible. It builds in reserves for technically challenging programs and fully accounts for program costs. We believe it's compelling in that it enables new initiatives tied to our strategic objectives, which are contained and delivered as part of our strategic plan. The law requires that the strategic plan be produced in the fall. We've accelerated that and released it as part of this budget in February. It advances our mission goals through a stepping stone approach to future exploration objectives and provides transformational technologies and capabilities that will open new pathways. And the proposal is about a new strategic direction for NASA that we have developed over the course of the last 9 months, and how we plan to shift resources towards longer-term goals outlined in the mission statement and the strategic plan therein. Just to quickly highlight, the budget contains 9 specific initiatives tied to mission goals that build on the strategic investments that were started as part of the fiscal year 2003 budget that the Congress just enacted a week ago. They are, first, Project Prometheus, which is to develop and demonstrate a breakthrough propulsion and power generation systems capability that will be at least a factor of 100 times greater than what we have been operating under since the beginning of our programs. The plan is to demonstrate that technology in the out years, and again, that's a proposition that we certainly will debate today and discuss, to fuel a specific, ambitious objective, as Congressman Rohrabacher mentioned in his opening statement, towards a capacity to demonstrate on-orbit, multiple on-orbit passes rather than one flyby, which has been our typical approach that we've been restricted to given the limitations of power generation and propulsion capabilities we currently deal with. It also includes a human research initiative to expand biomedical research and technology development to enable safe, long-duration missions on the International Space Station, as well as potential missions beyond low Earth orbit, and potential medical benefits for millions here on Earth. Includes an optical communications initiative, investment in revolutionary laser communications technology to demonstrate on a mission by transmitting large volumes of scientific information. This is akin to moving from the telegraph to a telephone in our approach on communications from space. A Beyond Einstein initiative, which develops 2 Einstein's observatories, LISA, a deep space gravity wave detector, and a Constellation X, a mission probing of what happens to matter at the edge of the black hole. Initiation of 3 probes designed to address key questions that Einstein left us. What powered the Big Bang? How did black holes form and grow? And what is the mysterious energy pulling the universe apart at present? Also funds a climate change research initiative, which accelerates research to reduce key scientific uncertainties and support the President's objectives to establish a climate change research objective to inform what policy alternatives we may then follow based on that information. We've also included an aviation security initiative to expand research to develop technologies to reduce the homeland security vulnerability of aviation to terrorist and criminal attacks. A national aerospace systems transformation augmentation, which accelerates the development of technology to address efficiency, capacity, and security needs for air travel. A quiet aircraft technology to continue work on technologies to significantly reduce community noise impact and achieve significant savings in amelioration programs in local communities. And, importantly, an education initiative that supports the newest enterprise function we have just created at NASA to fund the Educator Astronaut Program, the Explorer Schools, Explorer Institutes, and a Scholarship for Service Program, which is part of the Chairman's reference to the Human Resources legislative initiative that he's referred to as well. There are also continuing efforts to currently fund and enable us to achieve the core configuration of the International Space Station upon return to safe flight of the Space Shuttle program, accommodate the international partner elements which have been produced and are preparing for delivery to the Kennedy Space Center so that we may launch them upon return to safe flight, maintain progress on research priorities, and continue to build the International Space Station to whatever the science and research objectives guide us to. It also authorizes the establishment of a non-governmental organization like the Hubble Telescope program that we employ for the development and a prioritization of International Space Station research and science objectives. An integration space transportation plan, which has been delivered as part of the President's amendment to the fiscal year 2003 budget back in November, which we appreciate the Congress's endorsement of, and it continues that in 2004 to make investments in extended shuttle operational life, new orbital space plane for a crew transfer capability to station, and next-generation launch vehicle technologies for propulsion, structures, and operations. We're submitting to Congress, again, the strategic plan, which, again, is developed now and has been released as part of this budget as opposed to waiting until the deliberations are concluded in the fall, which has been the typical approach that has been taken under the terms of the Government Performance Results Act. and instead released it now as part of this particular effort, an integrated budget and performance document and performance and accountability report. These documents reflect the agency's improvements in areas specifically related to the budget, focusing on mission-driven activities that deliver end products with enterprises and capabilities rather than by program elements. Also, the budget is structured in 18 goal-oriented themes, which are very clearly laid out as an approach to deal with our objectives. A full cost accounting and management function is contained in this particular approach so that every time you look at any program or initiative, that the full amount that we believe is necessary based on our best cost estimates is reflected in the cost that we present. It allocates all costs by programs areas, incorporating institutional activities in program funding accounting. An integrated budget and performance document which informs the Congress of promised cost or estimate, schedule, and technical parameters of approved projects and merges the budget with the performance plan so that there's a direct relationship between the two. And finally, it includes an integrated financial management system. For the first time this year, NASA will be on one accounting system for the entire program across all field centers, and it's being implemented and will be operationally fully by June. We're halfway home right now. This is the first time in the agency's history we've achieved that objective. Lastly, on the financial front, gone with almost no notice, we received a clean opinion from our outside auditors, which was released as part of the effort as well, and that's the first time that's occurred in quite some time as well. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I do want to, again, commend you and thank you again for your personal sponsorship of the human resources initiatives, new tools that we have in order to address the really looming issues we are going to confront on personnel and continuing the competency and extraordinary expertise we enjoy around this agency. With new tools that we've requested from Congress, we presented a proposal that the President submitted as a legislative initiative last June. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the fact you've held hearings on that particular point. We look forward to enactment of those proposals at the earliest opportunity and gratified to hear of your sponsorship for an effort to continue that cause. Finally, again, this is, we believe, a responsible, credible, and compelling position we've taken here that is linked to a strategic plan that has performance goals and is an objective approach to how to proceed with the mission areas of understanding and protecting the home planet, exploring the universe and searching for life, and inspiring that next generation of explorers, our mission goals. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Administrator, and thank you for not only the look ahead in terms of the budget, but in terms of the update on the space station and her crew. Its crew. Which raises some questions. So before we get into the 04 budget specifics, let me address the issue. Now, it's my understanding that Expedition 6 crew, the 3 members, will be coming home in late April or early May to replace by a 2-member crew, Expedition 7. Administrator Golden, your predecessor, had pretty much led the committee to believe that you need a 2.5-member crew just to keep the station functioning. And why do you feel that a 2-member crew will be sufficient, and what additional risk and limitations are entailed in having a 2-member crew? And let me get to the final question that's long been on a lot of people's mind. Under what circumstances would you temporarily abandon the station entirely, and how long could it stay up there in orbit, unmanned?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The approach that we've taken, and again, I've in consulting over the course of the last year extensively with the Dr. Shannon Lucid, who is our chief scientist at NASA, as a former astronaut, spent a lot of time on Space Station Mir at that time, as a veteran of several flights, and is a scientist of quite considerable renown in her own right. Has really examined the issue of exactly what does it take in order to continue operations on station with the International Space Station team, and has determined that indeed we can continue science as well as maintain the operations of station with a 2-person crew. It is not optimum by any means, but it is limited to that based on our capacity on Progress vehicles and the Soyuz return egress emergency capabilities. In order to provide the appropriate consumables for the consumption of the crew, water, as well as spares and logistics requirements in order to maintain safe operations of the International Space Station. To your final, your second point of what is it that would motivate us to decrew or abandon the space station, any safety consideration would immediately motivate us to direct the crew to get into the Soyuz vehicle and return home and dim the lights, because we do not want to compromise the safety of those human beings one moment. And our attempt here is to assure that we can continue to support their activity, to maintain some science and research objectives aboard, not nearly as optimum as we can now, but to maintain this so that we can get to the point of returning to shuttle flight and maintaining and building the station out to the capability we think it's capable of being.
Then how long would the station be able to operate with the lights dimmed, as you put it, unmanned?
The best estimate there, and again, this is really very difficult to determine because there's any number of, when there's no human aboard to correct or fix any unforeseen technical problem that may emerge on station, assuming all that stayed exactly right and we could move the orbit of the International Space Station to avoid debris, to keep its altitude at the appropriate orbit levels, we could probably do that for 6 months to a year, assuming no other unforeseen circumstances. Anything that would crop up that would have no individual aboard would therefore likely mean a inability to make any repairs on orbit on station at the time, and that could compromise its continued operations.
So the conventional wisdom that it requires 2.5 members to just operate the station is passé. You're convinced that we can operate it with a 2-member crew without taking on, I can understand limitations of a 2-member crew with additional science or limited science, but without any additional risk?
Yeah, more importantly, my understanding is the International Space Station program manager, our chief scientist, who is a veteran astronaut and scientist herself, as well as our partners, the 16 nations engaged in this activity, are of a mind that that is a sustainable crew complement in order to keep operations of station going so that we can, at the earliest opportunity, return to flight and continue building that laboratory condition.
All right, let me go now to the 04 budget. The NASA budget is presented in a new format this year, which has some advantages, but it makes it difficult to make any useful comparisons between the budget proposal and those of previous years. NASA did convert the President's FY03 request into the FY04 format, but the more relevant FY03 numbers are the final appropriations figures, as you know, from the omnibus bill we passed just 2 weeks ago. Will NASA convert the FY03 appropriations figures into the FY04 format for the committee, and how quickly can you get to it? I mean, that is particularly important for us so we can have meaningful comparisons and know where we've been and where we are in like terms.
Yes, sir. No, we'd be happy to work with the committee to make that conversion. The enactment having occurred just last week, we're working away to try to establish that. We'll make that conversion as rapidly as possible. I assure you that's a high priority we'll work with you on.
Do you have any feel for the timetable? I mean, I assume that work is going on as we speak.
Couple of weeks, I'm reassured by the chief bean counter.
You've been characterized as a bean counter in previous fora.
Indeed, bean counters are people too.
Yes. No, I understand that. Chair recognizes Mr. Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. O'Keefe, I think, as we all know, the 7 families have sustained their loss, and you and Bob Cabana, by the way, were super at Houston, and your condolence and your kindness to the families, both in your speeches and the reception they received and the aftermath of it.
Thank you,
but now, as they go home and have time as their solace, they've sustained their loss. I find that the American people are really interested in accountability for survivability for any of other sons or daughters that man those birds and reach, as they say, reach for the sky. I think that's the thing that's on people's mind now, probably more than anything else. And we need to be focusing a lot more attention than we have on systems that could improve any space shuttle survivability for the future. I think that's keen on their minds and on the minds of the American people. And regardless of what Admiral Gaiman's board ultimately identifies as the cause of the accident, we need to focus on how to better protect the crew and if we should ever lose another shuttle. I presume we're going to be flying the shuttle. You know, my opening my questions here will have set forth some facts and they'll have some presumptions, and one of my presumptions is that we're going to be flying the shuttle for at least another decade and a half and maybe longer than that. That I may be wrong on that. Time will tell, but I can't imagine we'd want to fly the shuttle that long without making just serious attempts to increase the chances for crew survival in the event of another accident. And when I asked you about this on February the 12th at the joint hearing with the chairman here and John McCain and others, you indicated that you'd be willing to take another look at the problem. I'm glad to hear that, and I'd like to get some specifics. And one of the first questions I have is, when will you start your review of potential shuttle crew survivability systems?
Sure.
That's one thing, and I'll give you a chance to answer that in a minute. Second, how will you structure the review, and what options will you investigate? Next, how much do you estimate the review is going to cost? And when will the review be complete, if you can estimate or guesstimate at that? Will you have it done in time to propose any needed changes to this year's budget request that you're giving us? And when can you provide this committee with your plan for investigating potential shuttle crew survival systems?
Sir. Let me do my best to work through an approach that we've taken. And again, I appreciate very much your comments on February 12th. And we immediately began to look at that point. The approach we've taken is to look at, in the context of the orbital space plane objectives we've laid out, there is no favored configuration of what that would look like. And so as a consequence, there are at least 3 or 4 different options of what could ultimately be the configuration of an orbital space plane that would assure crew survivability by having that complement or redundant capability to shuttle in order to crew transfer and return to International Space Station. So there are at least 3 or 4 different dynamic designs.
Yeah, we're talking about the shuttle now.
I'm sorry. Yes or no? You just asked about crew survivability. I apologize.
Yeah.
So what we've engaged in is asked that group in order to look at all those survivability options. On the shuttle program itself, what we're looking at, and what is presented as part of the fiscal year 04 budget, is an increase in the overall modernization, operational life upgrade capabilities, as well as a service life extension program effort that is reflected in the budget before you, that we will adjust based on those recommendations of the Gaiman Board to the extent those are demonstrate that there are specific safety or survivability upgrades that are more or less required based on their findings. They won't be telling us which ones those are, but that'll lead us to some conclusions so we can specifically identify what are the most appropriate upgrades to do to maintain shuttle operations through the next decade. That's involved there. To the extent that there is a set of recommendations that would inform adjustments to this budget, positively I'll pursue those within the administration to determine what may be feasible to come back to the Congress with as a change to adjust that.
And the estimate, if any, or guesstimate of the cost?
Could not at this juncture. There is.
But you will be able to later?
Yes, sir. Okay. Believe we can.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Thank you very much, and members should know that we're going to try to stick to the 5-minute rule on question because there is so much interest in this, and we want to give all members an opportunity to participate. Mr. Smith.
Mr. O'Keefe, thank you for your leadership. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Hall, thank you for holding this hearing, especially at this time. You know, over the years, our country's space program certainly has contributed greatly to our sense of national identity. You know, from the pride and awe that I'm sure I and all Americans felt when Neil Armstrong took his first steps on the moon, to our sense of relief when the Apollo 13 crew came back safely. From the excitement generated by the wealth of scientific discovery that's resulted from the space exploration, to the deep sadness that we felt back in 1967, 68 when the Apollo 1 exploded on the launch pad, certainly in '86 when the Challenger exploded shortly after takeoff, and certainly with the Space Shuttle Columbia broke up during the final stages of reentry. You know, unfortunately, it's taken a tragedy, it seems to me, to focus on the needed scrutiny that we need to evaluate our space program. Americans want to know how the Columbia accident happened, but they also demand to know the cost-benefit of manned spaceflight. As we consider funding levels for NASA programs, it's important that this committee closely examine the policies most likely to benefit NASA in the future. I hope this committee is not going to shy away from that responsibility. Mr. O'Keefe, as chairman of the subcommittee on research, I have questioned witnesses on the justification for manned spaceflight in regards to scientific experiments because I'm concerned that the costs are high and the benefits too few compared to unmanned flight or ground simulation. With limited dollars for the research and tight budgetary times, it's imperative that Congress directs its funding towards investment that give us the greatest scientific return for the taxpayer's dollar. The Washington Post recently estimated the cost overrun on the space platform was $17 billion. One of the questions I have is, you've argued that NASA's investment must be driven by science. And in recent years, we have seen some spectacular scientific benefits from NASA's unmanned missions. And your budget, there's 40% spent for human spaceflight. And I guess my question is, how do you strike the right balance between the scientific efforts for manned and unmanned flight?
Indeed. Thank you, Congressman, for your very thoughtful question on that point. And on your first observation, I couldn't agree more. In the history of NASA, the highs have been very, very high, and the lows have been very, very low. And we are in the low. There's no doubt about that. And the tragedy of February 1st is certainly a reminder of the frailty of our abilities to support human spaceflight as well as every other mission we're engaged in. But also, I think it speaks to the professionalism and accountability. The balance, I think, is exactly as you allude. It is not an either-or proposition. It is how you most appropriately develop and use technology and the capacity for robotic capabilities, et cetera, and then utilize human intervention when necessary in order to achieve the greatest returns for that technology and capacity that's there. I use as the or I find most instructive the capacity of the Hubble telescope as being the most instructive example of that. Just last March, the Columbia, on its last successful flight, did a Hubble servicing mission in March of 2002, in which the capacity of the Hubble telescope was upgraded by a factor of 10. A number of different servicing requirements that could only be conducted by human beings in order to do this were utilized. And as a result, the capabilities of the Hubble telescope today are literally rewriting the astronomy books as a consequence of the information we've gained and learned from that remarkable astronomy instrument. Couldn't have been done
But
remotely.
still, you have to compare that with Galileo, with the Pathfinder mission, with the Kepler space scopes. And
Yes,
so
sir.
the balance seems to me is the challenge.
Very true. And indeed, the astronomy community considers the Hubble to be the #1 instrument that has informed their debate and understanding in a manner that could not have been accomplished were it not for human intervention. As it turns out, the most important element of the last servicing mission, ironically, was because all of the controls are on the left-hand side of the Hubble service or the Hubble modules. Is a left-handed astronaut by the name of John Grunsfeld was able to make those adjustments because he's left-handed. And as a result, that's not something we could have done remotely, and no right-handed astronaut could have done it as well. So it becomes a classic case of human intervention being an absolute necessity in order to gain the remarkable capacity we've seen that's rewriting the astronomy books. It's informing us of the origins of this universe.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen's time has expired. That, I can assure you, and all members of this committee, will be the continuing focus of this committee as we go forward. Mr. Gordon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. O'Keefe, at last April's subcommittee hearing on the Space Shuttle, I asked Fred Gregory how NASA would support the space station in the event the shuttle fleet was grounded for an extended period. At that time, he indicated that there wouldn't be a way to do that. I had assumed that a plan would have been put in place last year to support such a contingency, but apparently NASA is just now putting that plan together. And as you laid out this morning, I think that it's a responsible short-term plan to accomplish that. In that regard, you indicated in your testimony that the astronauts on the space station have sufficient supplies to stay up until June. In June, another Russian Progress cargo spacecraft would have to be launched to the station to support it. That's the plan. Unfortunately, things don't always go as planned. If for whatever reason, a launch vehicle failure or an inability to dock with the space station or whatever, the Progress does not resupply the space station in June, what is your plan? And more generally, what is your plan for supporting the space station in case the shuttle is grounded for a comparable 32 months as in the situation with the Challenger accident? And if there isn't a plan now, when can we expect that?
Yes, sir. Well, if there is no Progress vehicle that is launched in June of this year, indeed, I think the most likely option that we will pursue is to ask the 2 astronauts aboard Expedition 7 to board the Soyuz vehicle, dim the lights, and come home. Because we will not expose any member of the crew to a condition where we cannot sustain their activities for an extended period of time. So, yes, there is a very thin margin of activity here, but there is a very important option, which is to remove the crew as quickly as possible, and there is the capacity to do that. As it pertains to the longer-term objectives, again, we believe the basis upon which we've laid out the plan now and agreed to yesterday is through the next 18 months, if need be, and laid out the flights necessary, which accelerates the 2 Progress vehicles, maintains the Soyuz transfer schedule that had been agreed to even prior to February 1st, but is now using as a crew return capacity. And we will continue in that approach and look, as we discussed the other day, of what would happen beyond 18 months. So we're beginning that analysis now to see how much further beyond we could sustain that activity, and we're underway with that effort as a consequence of our discussion the other day.
And when would you expect that we could see a 32-month plan?
Certainly within the next couple of months, I think we can analyze that.
Thank you.
Let me poll the witness, first of all. There's a great deal of interest in continuing this, and there is also, as is so often the case at this time particularly, a competing interest, and that is Governor Ridge going to be giving a briefing on Homeland Security. And the chair, I have been appointed by the Speaker to be a senior member of that committee too, so more than my share of responsibilities. Would it be all right with you if we continue? Because there's a great deal of interest on the part of members to continue rather than to recess as originally projected. And I think they're going to have to depend on me and others who may wish to go over there to be able to brief everybody here when I come back. In the interim, we will have, is that all right with you, Mr.
At your
Minister?
pleasure, Mr. Chairman, of course.
I'm glad to turn over the chair now for the distinguished chair of the subcommittee, Mr. Rohrabacher of California. Sure. And with that, I will recognize him for his questioning.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
You know I would have been willing to take the chair, don't you?
I sense a willingness, an eagerness, if you will. But I want to keep you close to me, to the right of the chair.
Yes, you got it. Well, actually, some of us would like Ralph to have come over to the Republican side, and he might have been able to be chair. So, a couple of thoughts, but Mr. O'Keefe, it's my understanding that NASA has a rigorous flight readiness review prior to each and every shuttle flight. And given the risks, which now we are all too sadly aware of human spaceflight, this review would seem to be a critical moment in shuttle launches and shuttle safety. And as an administrator, first and foremost, are you personally satisfied that this process is working effectively, and just your thoughts on that?
Yes, sir. No, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
After all, we did have a shuttle disaster, and this is one of the pivotal moments.
Yes, sir. No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Indeed, there is a very rigorous flight readiness review that is the culmination of lots of work that goes on for weeks and months leading up to each and every launch, to sort out and analyze, examine, and to pray over every single anomaly that could possibly have been noticed or dealt with as the orbiter comes out of the orbiter processing facility and is ready to stack to be brought out to the launch pad. The flight readiness review is, again, kind of a culmination that usually occurs 2 weeks prior to the launch, in which any major anomaly, or any minor anomaly for that matter, is examined at great length. It usually takes at least a day and a half, and is attended by everybody and anybody that's associated with the program. It is held in a very large room, much like this, in which everyone is invited to and expected to speak if there is any anomaly. And each of those anomalies are worked through, and if it is not to the satisfaction of each of the participants, then the flight does not take place. And as the voting members of that group, it is chaired by the Associate Administrator for Spaceflight, Bill Reedy, who is a former astronaut, as well as attended by the flight or the center directors who are engaged in all the activity leading up to the flight itself. And it's also attended by the Associate Administrator for Safety and Mission Assurance, Brian O'Connor, who is also a former astronaut. And they must all concur before that flight is authorized to proceed. So that process is pretty rigorous. If it is adequate or not is something I will be guided by the Gaming Board to determine whether systemically that is adequate to assure safety of flight, but it certainly is a rigorous process. If it is adequate to assure safety, that's a decision or a finding that I look forward to seeing as to whether the Gaming Board concurs or not.
Are you personally involved in this process?
I have attended a few of the flight readiness reviews and have had an opportunity to kind of witness this opportunity or review of each issue. As a matter of fact, I made it a point to attend the flight readiness review in advance of the STS-112 flight, which was an examination of the fuel line crack issue that you may recall, that delayed and deferred flights from June to October until we satisfied ourselves that there was no way.
Okay, so you have personally gone there to make sure that this flight readiness review meets the right kind of standards, and
or at least to witness the procedure they go through and see how it operates, and it sure looks pretty rigorous to me.
All right. What are we doing right now in terms of weaning ourselves? This idea about being dependent on the shuttle for another decade and a half is frightening to me. What are we doing to wean ourselves away from the shuttle, and doesn't that mean that we're going to have an accelerated space maneuvering vehicle, orbital space plane program?
Yes, sir. Well, there's two things we're doing. I think the first one is to assure that we have a redundant or complementary system for safe crew transfer and return to International Space Station. We have proposed, as part of the President's amendment in November of 2002, the orbital space plane. Now, exactly what design and configuration that will be, we'll know within the next 18 months.
Well, let me know. You proposed this prior to the Columbia tragedy.
Yes, sir.
But don't you think that, considering what we've just gone through here with the loss of the Columbia, that this program needs to be dramatically accelerated? And where does that show in your budget?
Yes, sir. We certainly are examining, as part of the earlier inquiry, the opportunities for what is the soonest we could see achievement of the selection of a design, a competitive solution, which orbiter or orbital space plane alternative would be best, and move on with production as quickly as we can. That's currently being examined by the Orbital Space Plane Program Office at Marshall Space Flight Center now.
Well, this is something we need to look at because it doesn't seem, when you look at the long-term budget figures and you look at what we're investing in and what our needs are going to be a few years out, it doesn't all come together right now. And
well, the second factor, too, Mr. Chairman, if I could, I'm sorry, is really I'm not altogether convinced that the shuttle is not going to be capable of operating for an extended period. Well, again, we'll be guided by the Game and
well,
Board's
we've got
view.
three. We will be guided by the Game and Commission, but we've got 3 shuttles left, and
it's a marvelous heavy lift capacity. It really is.
And it's a marvelous way of eating up tax dollars as well. The bottom line is it's an engineering marvel, but it is one of the most expensive systems, which in and of itself, if we rely on it for too long, will eat up the seed corn we need for investing in a new system. And I know my time is up here, and I'll move on. And Mr. Lamson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator O'Keefe, I also want to add my thanks to the work that you and your team are doing, particularly in the light of this of the tragedy of Columbia. The Space Shuttle is currently the only vehicle in the world that can carry the remaining components of the International Space Station that are needed to complete construction. It follows that NASA will not be able to continue construction of the space station until the shuttle fleet is back in the air. The Space Shuttle is also the way that the United States carries crew and cargo to and from the space station. It is certainly conceivable that the shuttle fleet could be grounded for some time. We've heard several times this morning, after Challenger accident in 1986, the Space Shuttle fleet was grounded for 32 months. While the Columbia investigation is moving forward, there is always a possibility that the root cause of the accident may never be determined with absolute certainty. In the aftermath of the Columbia accident, it may be impossible to maintain the Space Shuttle's viability without help from the Russians. Payments by NASA to Russia to cover the cost of purchasing additional Soyuz and Progress vehicles appear to be prohibited under the terms of the Iran Non-Proliferation Act of 2000. And I know that the Iran Non-Proliferation Act provides a narrow exception, allowing the President to request a waiver from Congress only to, quote, prevent the imminent loss of life or grievous injury to individuals aboard the International Space Station, unquote. Mr. O'Keefe, have you ever asked President Bush to seek a waiver from the Iran Non-Proliferation Act, either before or after the Columbia tragedy, to purchase additional Soyuz or Progress vehicles?
No, sir, I have not.
Well, I believe that we need to ensure that the space station remains operational while the shuttle fleet is grounded. And I also believe the administration needs more flexibility under the Iran Non-Proliferation Act of 2000 to cover the cost of additional Soyuz and Progress vehicles at this time. Therefore, I plan to introduce legislation today that amends the Iran Non-Proliferation Act of 2000 to allow NASA to purchase additional Soyuz and Progress vehicles if the President notifies Congress that they are needed to ensure the safety of the crew aboard the International Space Station and to maintain its operational viability while the Space Shuttle fleet is grounded. Try to respond not to a crisis, but to be able to allow you the flexibility to plan the potential of whatever that need may be. Obviously, the safety of our astronauts should be paramount, and NASA should not be prevented from doing whatever is necessary to ensure that that safety is maintained. And let me switch to another question. We've talked a little bit about the orbital space plane, and it's my impression that NASA's schedule calls for a decision sometime by the end of 2004 as to whether or not we're even going to go forward with that project. If NASA decides at the end of fiscal 04 that it is not appropriate to proceed with full-scale development of an orbital space plane, how do you intend to provide a crew rescue vehicle for the International Space Station, considering that last year we canceled the crew return vehicle project in favor of the orbital space plane? And the second question, the space station operating cost estimates developed by NASA assume that crews and cargo would be taken to the space station by the Space Shuttle. If NASA also intends to fly the orbital space plane to the space station, how much will that increase space station annual operating costs?
Well, to your first question, sir, the crew return vehicle requirements, again, as I think you're aware, are contained as part of the requirements list that is summarized on one page for the orbital spaceplane, which includes specific attribution of crew return vehicle, crew rescue capacity, and that's an accommodation as a result of the versatility as well as flexibility of that asset, which we envision to be accomplished by several different design alternatives. So I am anticipating success of picking a successful design within the next 18 months so that we can get about the business of assuring a crew transfer capability that's maneuverable, provides flexibility, and does accomplish the transfer objectives, and therefore using shuttle more for its heavy lift cargo capacity as it was originally designed to do in the first place. So there's a great complement that comes from both of these assets.
Is that in 2010 though? Is that your
certainly that is the current projection at present. That's what we've asked industry to comment on, to look at the viability of that. And again, in pursuit of Mr. Rohrbacher's question earlier, that's what we're looking to seek alternatives of how that may be accelerated or adjusted based on whatever the findings may be.
And what will we be doing until that?
Well, until that time, and it's the second part of your question, is what do we do in order to assure emergency egress capability for International Space Station? There is the Soyuz module that is aboard right now, and it will be again in April and again in October, and each 6 months we rotate that capacity to assure its survivability to withdraw the crew. There are additional docking ports that could be considered to look at additional Soyuz vehicles in the future if need be. There is a design alternative as part of the orbital spaceplane effort to look at a capsule that may be utilized for that purpose, and again the orbital spaceplane itself, which is a crew transfer vehicle that has flexibility, maneuverability, that would assure close to on-demand requirements as we can get to provide crew transfer capabilities.
Would you have been able to get access, or would you be able to get access to those under the present Iran Non-Proliferation Act, or would we need to have some type of legislation like what I've spoken of?
Well, again, I would not presume what the outcome of the Congress working its will on the issues of public policy may yield. And so as a consequence of that, the approach we have taken with our partners is we're all acting like partners in this approach. And so the issue of exactly how the Russians would finance the issues pertaining to the Soyuz change-out, both
we buy them directly from them. Are you saying that they might be willing to give them to us or others?
We don't buy Soyuz vehicles from the Russians directly.
Could we do that?
Again, under the terms of the Iran Non-Proliferation Act, there is the one exception, as you cited.
Yes.
There is currently not a need to do a direct purchase because the partners are all participating in how not only we accelerate this effort, but also finance it. And as a result of that, the European Space Agency, for example, 2 astronauts had planned from ESA to fly on Soyuz in April and another one in October. That was to be a compensation or agreement between the European Space Agency and the Russians, which they have now continued those payments even though those seats will not be occupied under this new agreement as of yesterday, and they will establish that as a credit for the future at some time. All the partners are acting like partners. Everybody's participating, and there is at this juncture no requirement that I see to seek exceptions or any other change that's involved. But we'll keep you posted as we move along with this. This is a uncertain territory we're in right now for sure, but we are all acting like partners, and I am mightily impressed with the capacity of the Canadians, the European Space Agency, the Rosaviacosmos, our Russian friends, and the Japanese partners, all stepping up to be part of an international understanding of how we continue operations. It's impressive.
Thank you, Mr. Lamson.
Thank you very much.
Chair appreciates Mr. Lamson's activism on this committee and on the subcommittee as well. Just for the information of those present and also for Mr. O'Keefe, as chairman of the subcommittee, I have been talking to both the members of the Russian government and members of the executive branch, as I mentioned to you, Mr. O'Keefe, I think a few days ago. And this is not contradictory at all to Mr. Lamson's legislative proposal, but that the Iran Non-Proliferation Act, which I believe is important, which is something to suggest that we'd like the Russians not to be building a nuclear power plant for the Iranians as long as Iran is controlled by these radical mullahs. One other way out of that, rather than just demanding that the Russians step away from a lucrative contract at a time when their own economy is in the pits, we should be giving them a financial incentive to do so. And I have suggested to the administration that we offer the Russians international financing or loan guarantees of some kind in order to build power plants, for example, for India or Turkey, which are non-threatening countries, which they could then not have to suffer financially from the loss of this contract, and instead of just making a demand that they walk away. And I think that's giving them that incentive is certainly an important thing. If that does not work, Mr. Lampson's alternative is certainly something we need to take very seriously, and because we're hitting right at a very critical moment and a critical part of the decision-making process that will make our success possible in the future.
The only point in this is to try to make it give the flexibility for action,
right,
so that we're not having to react to a crisis.
Right. And with that, I would like to recognize Vern Ehlers, who's chairman of our subcommittee on environment and technology and standards, and also is one of the more educated of members of this committee, I might add.
Congressman, if you permit me just a brief comment to your last statement, if you would, Congressman.
Yes.
There's no question the issues you've just summarized are precisely the kinds of foreign policy concerns that positively, I think, have bearing on the activities that we're engaged in now. Given the nature and the intensity of the portfolio we currently have at NASA, the last thing I want to do is presume any part of Secretary Powell's portfolio. So I'll be guided by the foreign policy objectives that Secretary Powell and the State Department view are important, and we'll certainly live with that. But at present, there is no requirement whatsoever to deal with this issue by virtue of the partners all acting like partners. This has been an impressive step up, given the nature of the tragedy we've experienced on February 1st, and I think we should be all we're seeing the results of laboring to pull together this partnership and what it can yield. It's been impressive.
Having witnessed you in Japan mustering the support from our space station partners before the Columbia tragedy, I understand it's a high priority in your office. Mr. Ehlers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. O'Keefe, for being here. Sure. After all that you and Mr. Reedy have been through the past few weeks, I'm sure you could use a day off instead of appearing before us for another grilling. And I want to assure you and all of the NASA family of our continuing sympathies for them, and appreciate all your work and Mr. Reedy's in dealing with the tragedy.
Thank you, Congressman. We're doing our best. We appreciate that.
Well, you've done a very good job, and I appreciate that. I have several comments. First of all, I want to, in terms of the budget you've presented, I want to thank you for the increases you have put in for the scientific research effort of the agency. Over the past decade, the space station, or perhaps I should say the cost overruns of the space station, have been an albatross around the science program in terms of its funding. We have not done well with many of our science efforts. We have doubled NIH. We have passed a bill to double NSF. And my goal is to do the same for DOE and for NASA, because there's a great deal of important science to be done, and you're the agency to do it. So I appreciate what you have done within the limits that were placed upon you.
Well, thank you.
I also appreciate you bringing order to the accounting and the budget of NASA. I assumed you would do that when you were appointed, and I think that's one of the big reasons you were appointed. It's great progress. I hope you will also bring sense to another area, and that is introduce the metric system to NASA. I cannot understand, as an agency that's supposed to be science-driven, still not using entirely the metric system, and we have a $160 million loss as a result of that. I have introduced a bill to deal with that, and out of kindness to NASA, I have let it languish, but it's time to reintroduce that and pursue that. There's no reason in the world, when the rest of the world uses a metric system, that NASA should continue to use a non-metric system in part of its operations. So I hope you can bring that same sense of good accounting to that problem as well and say, we got to make it uniform, it's cheaper, it'll save money, and so let's do it.
I am trainable, Congressman. I'll work on it.
Great. I also want you to succeed at it. On the Prometheus project, that's been kicking around in one form or another for many, many years. What has changed that makes you and the agency believe this is worthwhile to pursue at this time? Have there been some breakthroughs in it, or do you simply believe that the time is ripe to make this work?
Yes, sir. Well, it is certainly is a known technology. There is no question we know how to develop and harness nuclear power for what has been the equivalent of, I think, about 125 million miles that our U.S. Navy assets have utilized, which is roughly the distance between here and Mars, by the way, that they have conducted safely during the course of the better part of 35 years of their experience. And so we're seeking to work with them, given their design prowess and capacity for understanding reactors, for a much smaller reactor requirement that we have than what you'd ever utilize on an attack submarine or an aircraft carrier, which they've, again, proficiently developed and designed and operated safely for many, many years, to take that same design prowess and apply it to a much smaller requirement for power generation and propulsion capability, and to get on with it. Let's go ahead and let's begin developing that, which will improve speed for in-space propulsion and traversing by a factor of 3, or establish a considerable on-orbit time, which we currently don't have the opportunity to do. And to your point, I think very importantly, Congressman, of the science objectives, the thing that is most impressive, I think, about the capability of utilizing this propulsion and power generation capacity is that it provides a factor of 100 greater of power capacity for science and research objectives than what we currently deal with. Right now, any space probe that we send up, any spacecraft, be it any one of the number of capabilities we use for scientific unmanned capabilities, basically requires a power generation of roughly the equivalent of 2 60-watt light bulbs. So all the scientific and research objectives have to be built around that limitation. Now we're looking at something that is 100 times greater than that, simply because of the power source we're using. Is it the best approach? Don't know. I think there may be some future ones that are better, but it certainly is one that's mature enough we can get on with this and finally make a technical breakthrough that has been long overdue.
But my understanding is you're going to use it for propulsion as well as operating.
As well as power generation, yes, sir.
Yeah,
both.
Right. And that, of course, your limitation is whatever material you're using, and I believe you're using xenon.
Yes, sir, but let me get you more information for the record, though.
I would appreciate that, because yes, this raises a host of other questions in my mind, technical questions, which is probably not appropriate to ask at this point. And so I'd appreciate some additional information.
Yes, sir. I'd be delighted to provide that.
All right. Just one last comment at the request of Chairman Bullard, who had to leave. You suggested that NASA had already studied the risks associated with a two-person station. Are you planning any new assessments of that risk at this time?
Again, I'll be guided by 3 very important inputs. The International Space Station Program Management, which has really worked over this question very, very hard in leading up to the options that were agreed to yesterday. From a technical standpoint, Shannon Lucid, as the chief scientist, from her operational experience as well as that of a scientist who understands exactly what the parameters of requirements are, and by our international partners who have agreed to and participated in this particular process to arrive at the conclusions we talked about this morning. That triangulation of, I think, very deep expertise at least satisfies me that the right technical folks, the right safety concerns, and the right scientific objectives have been, and our partnership arrangements have been factored into this conclusion.
So you don't plan a new assessment then?
We're going to continue to look at, this is uncharted territory we're in, and so in that regard, if there is any adjustment need to be made, again, the last thing we will do is compromise the safety of the humans aboard a station at any time, and we will dim the lights and come on home if there's ever a concern that's raised on that front.
Thank you. And just a
Thank you,
quick
sir.
anecdote, when I asked how much xenon you had to have on board, I was told 3,900 pounds.
Is that right?
My question was, how many kilograms is that?
I will work on a more proficient answer, sir.
That was, boy. Vern does this to us, too, I'll tell you. We now would go to Mr. Weiner, who is Congressman Weiner, who is a very active member of this committee, and especially has shown his interest in the past in aeronautics. And, Mr. Weiner, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Administrator, Mr. Chairman. This hearing, notwithstanding the title of the hearing, has been a surreal exercise in ignoring the elephant in the room. Today, we see on the front page of our daily papers memorandum from members of your staff or contractors that in a haunting way show that there were investigations, research, theories and memos about what could have gone wrong that predicted almost to the point. Putting aside whether or not you're always going to find memos, you're always going to find people saying different things. I pick up today's USA Today and find that not last month, not 3 weeks ago, but yesterday, you were interviewed by the USA Today editorial board. And you said in a response to a question, had there been any indication before 8:52 on the morning of February 1st, we would have used every ounce of energy, capacity, and professionalism into solving the problem. That's yesterday. When asked about emails that had become public, you said that they were resolved at the operational level. But perhaps what is more stunning is you had informed the editorial board you hadn't even read the memos yesterday. You know, we have offered a lot of praise for you, I personally have, for trying to not repeat the errors made in the Challenger incident, where it was not Congress that solved the problem and got to the truth. It was not NASA. It was a whistleblower and reporters that did it. Now, I would point out that the emails that were revealed yesterday were subject to Freedom of Information Act requests. I have two questions, sir. First of all, why was it that even if there is a hint of a footnote of a memo on a scrap of an envelope that was within this investigation scope, that it only made its way to you yesterday at the same time it made its way to everyone else on the AP wire? And have you fired anyone for not bringing them to your attention sooner?
Mm-hmm. Well, the release of information, again, what we've been responding to now, our first priority each and every time is anytime the Columbia Accident Investigation Board asks for any information, we produce it immediately. And we're trying.
May I interrupt you on that point?
By all means, sir.
So they had it before you. When did they get the memo?
I don't know when they received those emails.
So they would have to ask, do you have any memos from Mr. Jones on February 17th that we should know about? Well, exactly.
No,
I mean,
sir.
it's
No, sir.
stunning to me that this is the process that's being followed because, if you recall, sir, this is exactly Morton Thiokol. This is exactly what happened. We had to wait for something to bubble up to the surface, and you're the director, and you're the administrator. I'm just curious. Perhaps we should take a step back. You have a space shuttle in the sky, okay? I can't think of anything more important on your desk when a space shuttle is up in the sky than how's it doing, okay? And I cannot imagine, I mean, is that fair to say that that's probably job one of the administrator when the shuttle is up in the air, to be keeping an eye on what's going on with it?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So am I to believe that there is a level in the information flow below which you aren't devoting any level of analysis? There's no memo coming to you? I would be surprised if there's one person in the entire organization that raises a concern you as the administrator would not want to be aware of. And this was a vigorous debate among experts going back and forth. Now, admittedly, again, I'm not informed enough to make a decision about whether it was right or wrong or anything else. God willing, we'll come to that conclusion soon. But what is absolutely amazing to me is that I read the stuff before you did. I mean, that's crazy. I mean, don't you agree? I mean, you must have gotten these memos and hit the roof. Is that a fair characterization?
Let me try to respond to your earlier questions, and I'll try to arrive at each of the ones you've just raised. I apologize for the time. First one is, again, we are releasing every bit of information, not when the Accident Investigation Board asks for it. We're trying to get it out as fast as possible.
Sir, I have 8 seconds left.
Yes, sir.
I'm not really interested in when the New York Times got it. I'm interested in when you, the guy that we put in charge of this, got it. When did you get it?
Let me try to answer each of your questions.
No, that's the one I'm most interested in my last 8 seconds.
Well, I'm sorry, sir. I thought each of your questions were equally important.
No. I prioritize.
Mr. Weiner, we'll be happy to extend you another minute to make sure that the administrator will be able to answer your questions.
Thank you, sir. The most important thing I want to know is when you found out about it, what you did when you found out about it, and and just to get some reaction to the idea that you got it yesterday afternoon.
Yes, sir. We've been collecting up all of the information here, all the facts, all the evidence, every piece of information that's been involved, and upon examination of that, releasing it without any filtering from me. Again, we are trying desperately to be sure that we put everything out on the table as we are able to collect it all, and it's an awful lot of information being done. And if you would, sir, please, there is a process that is underway, I think, to collect all that information on every anomaly that may have been noted and discussed and debated. One of the other ones I've looked at is the temperature and the climate control. The board...
Stand by, sir. I have to interrupt because, frankly, sir, this is a problem that I think we're having in gathering information about this. I want to hear about the other anomalies. Believe me, I do. We all do. I have a limited amount of time. I cannot imagine, if I'm running the agency, and hopefully we're never in that unfortunate position, that if I'm running the agency, on February 1, I send out an email to every single person, send me any possible thing that you might have noted going wrong, and I would have done nothing, stayed up all day and all night as the administrator to read it. And then the first question I would have asked is, you know what, if we had this observation and this type of investigation going on, I'm in my office, I'm the administrator of NASA, I have a shuttle up in the air that has reached the point that just like in the Challenger accident, there were people that were saying troubling things. That's what I'm concerned about. I'm not concerned about you disgorging information.
Mr. Weiner, if we could, I'd be happy to give you more time to have the administrator answer your questions, but not for you to go on.
That's certainly fair, and I apologize for being a little hot under the collar. But my concern is not about all the anomalies, or how it was disgorged, or how great you've been in letting people know what's going on. My concern is from your desk, how it is that you're finding out things after I am. I mean, this seems to me to be a fundamental problem in the management of the agency.
Well, Mr. Weiner, we'll give the administrator one chance to answer the question, then we'll move on.
I'll do my best, Mr. Chairman and Congressman. Again, the approach that we take on every operational activity is we encourage, expect, demand that everybody exchange what they believe to be the solutions or difficult responding to anomalies that would occur on flight. There are lots and lots of these. Again, this flight readiness review went through a full day and a half leading up to that for weeks beforehand. There are lots of different issues that are worked through. I certainly am not privy to every single one of those deliberations that go across an agency of 18,000 people and another 100,000 folks who are engaged in launch operations and the continued activities of the agency. As we work through this, we are expecting that folks at every responsible level work through this. And based on what I can see, the vetting of all this information that occurred on orbit during the operational mission was handled by the individuals. They vetted those questions, satisfied themselves that there were solutions that could be found, and determined if there was a safety of flight risk to be attendant to that, and ascertained that there was not in their judgment. The thing I'm really anxious to see, Mr. Congressman, is when the Gaming Board comes to conclusion on this, is there a systemic or management question of where those judgments are made that needs to be altered? And that's the point I think that's central to all of your inquiries, if I could, sir. And that's the point that I think we really need to examine very, very carefully. The proposition that every single piece of correspondence and discussion will move through a single filtering aspect means that we would have gridlock. And so in that context, there is an expectation that people will be professional, step up to those responsibilities, iterate those questions, and they do on each and every one of these flights. And that's what happened in this case, and absolutely will be guided by the judgment of the board as to whether that was an appropriate systemic or management approach to it, but it sure looks like that dialogue went on at the exact right levels for the operational considerations.
Thank you very much, Mr. O'Keefe, and let me know all of us on this committee are looking forward to the Gaiman Commission's analysis of these very issues that Congressman Weiner is bringing up, and many other issues that we know that are vital to determining exactly what went wrong, and whether or not which people should be held accountable if mistakes were made. And I'm not an expert. Congressman Wiener's not an expert on this, but it's important for us to bring these up, and we do expect to have the answers from the experts on the commission within a few months at least.
Yes, sir. We want to know the truth. There's no question about that at all, and we're going to find out what it is. We're going to make the corrections necessary as recommended, and we're going to figure out what it's going to take to get back to flying safely, responsibly, and accountably.
Thank you very much. And now we have Mr. Bonner from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. O'Keefe, in light of your most recent statement that you want to get to the truth, and in light of the previous question as well, I worry that some in the media, some in Congress, and some investigators are putting too much emphasis on trying to assess blame on this tragedy. Clearly, as we pursue an investigation such as this, we've got to do everything we can to get to the bottom of what caused the tragedy and what we can learn to ensure that such a tragedy never occurs again. In military accident investigations, the primary thrust has historically been on determining the real root cause of an accident, thereby allowing for meaningful corrective action to take place, rather than trying to affix blame. The search for root cause is aided immeasurably by a free and open flow of information that occurs between the investigators and the hundreds of technicians and other people that take place. I worry, and I think many in this body worry, that if we try to affix blame solely, then those hundreds, if not thousands of people who are concerned more about protecting their backsides than providing that information to get to the root cause and to find out what happened, will, in fact, that process will be stymied. So I guess my question is, are you comfortable thus far into this investigatory process that an open and free flow of information is occurring, and do you feel that we're doing enough to encourage such a free flow of information?
Yes, sir. There's no question in my mind that's what's occurring, and more importantly than my opinion or view, that's Admiral Gaiman's view, and the members of his board are absolutely of that mind. And as a consequence, there is just a tremendous amount of information that's being analyzed now, but it is all being made available. And I am stunningly impressed by the professionalism of every individual in this agency who's participating to make sure this is an absolutely open and above-board process where every scrap of information is available for examination to determine what happened here. We don't know, and they're narrowing down, I think, through a very disciplined way on the investigation board exactly what the causes could be, and using precisely the methodology you described very succinctly, of trying to narrow down what those theories would be and then move ahead based on the preponderance of evidence on what they think the cause or probable cause would have been.
Shifting gears a little bit, because NASA obviously has many important issues on its plate. Many people, I think, over the years recall with fondness sitting around our television sets and watching with anxious breath, watching the Apollo missions succeed, watching man take its first step on the moon. And over the years that have evolved, sadly, it's taken Challenger and Columbia, the tragedies, to make us aware of the real danger and risk associated with these missions that have occurred in the years that have come since that time. But one of the things that I think many Americans are looking for is, what is the ongoing mission, and how do these space explorations continue to benefit those of us here on Earth at this particular time? One thing that I'm particularly interested in, as a member of Congress who represents the Gulf Coast and the 1st District of Alabama, is the work that NASA is doing with regard to red tide. It's something that affects not only we've lost a lot of species, it's also had a negative effect on the health of people along the Gulf Coast. I would appreciate it if you could, if NASA could get me some additional information on that type of research. And I think that's just another example of where the research that you're doing with your agency and work with the other agencies like NOAA is actually going to help benefit the quality of life here on Earth. I thank you very much for your very difficult job that you're doing, and I commend you on it very much.
Well, thank you, Congressman. I appreciate it very much. I would commend to you, sir, the strategic plan I referred to earlier, which we have labored mightily to make sure it's readable. Most strategic plans are mighty fine doorstops. This one we really worked on for many, many months to be sure that it explains as succinctly and narrowly, so it's not an intimidating size, that really lays out what the strategy is and the approach we're looking at. And in there is a specific discussion of the kind of earth science programs that we are engaged in pursuit of climate change research initiative that the President expects that we will be supporting, and roughly half the assets that are necessary to complete that task are assets that NASA is employing for those purposes, to understand and protect our home planet as the primary first mission objective that we've stated incurs. But it is a comprehensive approach, and I'd be delighted to make sure you have further information on that specific activity of earth science applications at your convenience, and we'll produce it right away.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman.
Congressman Wu has had to leave, and he wanted me to mention for the record that he will be submitting written questions to you about the nature of the ceramic tile and some of the problems there. And I would like to everyone note that there will be you can present written questions to the administrator at the end of the hearing or within a week afterwards, and we would expect then those questions to be answered by NASA. In the meantime,
yes,
Mr. Davis of Tennessee, who is a freshman, I believe, and a new member of our committee, will proceed.
You're supposed to turn the speaker on, I guess, and one of my first questions I would like to ask, as a member of this committee, make a comment as well. 500 some odd years ago, we started reaching out and found that there were new continents on the Earth. And I know that as we look into the future with our space program, that we're looking to go to different planets and maybe even beyond that to other solar systems. And I certainly applaud the vision and the courage and those who work with NASA to reach out and to search beyond where we are today, to go to the stars that some of those earlier folks looked to enhanced visions through telescope and identified some of those, and quite frankly did quite a good job. We haven't done much of that even in modern time. We haven't found much greater in our stars than was there defined over the last several hundred of years. One of our better citizens, I guess, most revered citizens, Roger Crouch, is an astronaut that was on Space Shuttle 83 and Space Shuttle 94. I know that the one in 83, a lot of concern as we saw one of the fuel cells, I think, that stopped on us, and we had to shorten that flight to 4.5 days. And my grandson, who was 6 years old, was able to see the number 94 go up, of which Mr. Crouch was on. I know that exploring space is something that's certainly important to all of us. As Kennedy said, the new frontier is not beyond the Mississippi River necessarily, but the new frontier for America is to walk on the moon. In 1969, as Scoutmaster, I sat with a group of young Boy Scouts who saw a landing on the moon, and the pride that all of us in America had as we captured the first place as being in space. And I understand as we do these flights with the shuttle that we do quite a bit of research, some that perhaps might even find a cure for an illness that we have. Perhaps new materials will make it more comfortable or easier to live here on Earth. And I applaud that research as well. And I hope that we don't allocate funding searching for the stars when we still have a lot of searching to do for those of us who inhabit the Earth. But a question I have, and I hope that you might be able to answer this, I also watched my wife being a teacher as the Challenger in 1986 that we lost. And at that time, there had been some estimates when we first started talking about space flights that the possibility of losing one flight in 1,000 was something that we had to accept, that there were changes in flying into space. And when that one blew up, we decided it was 1 in 78, and now we have 1 in 57 is the record that we have for our space shuttle flights. Question I have is that what accident rate is too low or too high for us? And I think that we need an honest debate on establishing some accident rate, over the next few years, to be sure that those that explore beyond Earth for Americans greater than we have. And I question whether or not we should continue to target dollars for somewhere beyond Earth when we really ought to be putting more dollars in NASA or targeting more of those dollars for research that will improve the quality of our life here on Earth.
Yes, sir. No, I agree. There's no question that the risks involved in this activity are not inconsequential. We've seen that dramatically displayed, and there are no more, I think, courageous people that I have met in this last 4 weeks than the families of those astronauts. They are absolutely stunningly inspiring people, and they have dealt with this in a way that, frankly, I just don't know if any of us would have been as strong as they have been. It's an extraordinary effort. What they also have reminded me, though, each and every time I've had a chance to talk to them, is that each time we're engaged in these activities of exploration throughout the history of humankind, there is always a risk attendant to that, or else the safest way to do it is don't go at all. And I think the important question you've raised, and the one that I find really something that requires a soul search, is at what point do you say the potential cost of exploration, going there to a place that is not typically gone to or gone to at all, that at what point do you say it is not worth that potential risk? And if that weren't the case, I think as you started at the very beginning of your commentary, we would not have achieved what we have as human beings over the course of lots of exploration objectives. Lewis and Clark would have quit in the first few days. Magellan would never have taken the trip, instead of coming back with only 3 of the original crew members he began with. I mean, there are just a number of different events in human history that if you look to, it really has to be worth that price. And that's the more important point that I think you've identified that is really occupying my thought on this question of at what stage is the yield of what it is we think we can gain by the continued exploration relative to what that risk is once we manage that to the lowest level we can within the limits of human frailty.
Thank you very much, Mr. Administrator. And one wonders what type of investment in the ice moon of Jupiter is going to return to us, and what the total expense is going to be over the whole trip, which we haven't gotten into yet, but maybe we will.
Yes, sir.
Later on. We now have Mr. Feeney from Florida, another freshman, but who's been very active in his own state government, now has come to share those talents nationally.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. O'Keefe, for again appearing before us. And I understand that the overwhelming issue that all of us are interested in is the investigation and hopefully the cause of the tragedy, which we can remedy. But we still have to do a budget, and this is a budget hearing, and so as opposed to trying to force this watched pot to boil quicker as we try to get to the bottom of the investigation, I'd like to focus my questions on budget-related matters. How and what do you anticipate, and I understand there are a lot of things that are still up in the air related to short and long-term planning as a consequence of the disaster, but how do you plan to utilize the shuttle and the International Space Station workforce at Kennedy Space Center in particular, but elsewhere as well, during the stand-down period for the shuttle fleet? Do you see any immediate reductions in these workforces because of the stand-down? If so, when do you anticipate those decisions would be made, and what can we do for the employees that may be affected?
Sure. Well, as our experience, again, has been that each time there is any anomaly that we see that would compromise safety of flight, we have done the stand-down. As recently as June to October of last year was an extended stand-down as we worked through the fuel line crack issues that we had detected on one orbiter to make sure they weren't on others. And during the course of that time, that required, I think, a continued activity on the part of all of the folks in the workforce, both at NASA as well as the contract community that support the launch activities. That is a lot of work still continuing to go on, and we're anticipating as soon as possible returning to safe flight as the recommendations of the board are released. To the extent that that permits us to do so, we shouldn't see any diminution of that. Right now, the next orbiter that was to have launched in March is Atlantis. It was stacked and ready to roll out to the launch pad. We are now destacking the orbiter to assure that everything and anything that needs to be examined here in the course of our investigation and of the Gaming Board's review of said investigation is examined to assure safe flight. So there's plenty of things to keep lots of folks busy, and they are very, very diligently working all that, as well as continuing to receive the International Space Station components that are coming and delivering to Kennedy. I think at the end of next month, the Node 2, which is the primary configuration component that permits the attachment of all the international partner modules in the future, is due to arrive at Kennedy. And that'll take the better part of a year of testing and checkout and assuring that all those parts are compatible with all the other components that are involved there. So there's a lot to do, and there's an incredible attention to detail that's going on at each of the centers, particularly at Kennedy as well, in doing this, as well as the reception of all the debris that has been trucked to Kennedy to lay out to give us a better understanding of what could possibly have happened on this flight. So a lot of busy activity going on, and a lot of folks really attended to it and spending an awful lot of time above and beyond any normal work day. They are really dedicating themselves to it every day, and we're very proud of them.
No immediate intended...
I want to know what we could do without them.
Wonderful.
You know, couldn't continue.
Mr. O'Keefe, while we wait for a fix to the shuttle problem, should Congress decide to appropriate additional resources for an expedited development of the orbital space plane, could we shorten the time frame and get into action before 2010 in a meaningful way, in your opinion, and what would it take in terms of resources to do that?
Might be able to, and that's exactly what we're looking at now. We're trying to, the Orbital Space Plane Program Office and our aeronautics technology enterprise folks are looking at that very, very carefully right now to try to see what permutations of the schedule we could look to accelerate that activity. So we should have some answers to that in a relatively short order.
And finally, can you describe the collaborative efforts between Department of Defense and NASA with respect to the next generation launch vehicles? Are we working well together? Are there additional things that we need to give you in terms of tools and resources to work with DOT in that regard?
I think it's doing exceptionally well. We have a standing partnership arrangement that we work with all the elements of the Defense Department, particularly the Air Force and the Strategic Command, the Defense Research and Engineering activities, in order to really contribute heavily to the activities of the next generation launch technologies. Dr. Ron Sega, who is a former astronaut, as a matter of fact, is the Director of Defense Research and Engineering. We have worked very, very closely and very collaboratively on hypersonics capabilities, a range of different programs that they see applications for that we also will view for the future, and we're looking to accelerate that. It's a very close, extremely professional and personally rewarding arrangement and relationship that we have that I think is doing nothing but yielding great dividends. So we're going to continue on that effort as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Administrator.
Thank you, Congressman.
And we have Mr. Bell from Texas, 25th Congressional District.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And actually from Houston, Texas, and so the impact of the Space Shuttle tragedy has been fully felt in my district, and I very much admire the way that the agency has conducted itself, the way you have handled the situation personally, and I want to say that. And obviously, it's extremely important to people in my district to see the space program move forward. I wanted to try to achieve some clarity on something that you said early on in your testimony here today in response to a question from the chair, and I think I understand what you mean, but I think it's awfully important as we move forward and as this discussion continues about where the space program is going. And you were talking about the space station and what would drive the decision to dim the lights, I think was your expression, and talked about any safety consideration could lead to the dimming of the lights. And what I think is very important as this debate moves forward is that people not forget that there are huge inherent risks involved with manned space flight, and that astronauts willingly accept those risks when they decide to take part in the program. And so what I'd like for you to perhaps touch on is when you talk about safety considerations, and I think everybody realizes that every effort is made to make every mission as safe as possible. But what kind of safety considerations are we talking about that could lead to a dimming of the lights?
Well, again, I agree with you entirely that the ethos of the astronaut corps and the cosmonaut corps is that you take every single alternative before you ever abandon anything. There is no doubt about it. There's a very committed, extremely professional, well-trained, and extraordinarily impressive group of people who are committed to that set of objectives. There's no doubt about it. The kinds of things that I think would compromise safety in these cases, and we've got multiple scenarios we've worked through and simulations of what could happen and work on International Space Station, to look at each of the potential permutations of what could occur that would necessitate abandonment. And it is a very low number of circumstances. There's no doubt about it. A fire aboard the International Space Station in and of itself may not necessarily necessitate abandonment. If it can be contained and worked, and they've all been trained to deal with those kinds of questions, then they do just that. And it's the last possible alternative they consider is to leave. The point that I think the chairman raised that I think is particularly relevant in this case is that our margin that is necessary to support sustained permanent presence aboard International Space Station until we return to shuttle flight is dependent upon not only the Soyuz capsule always being attached so that they have an emergency egress capacity, but also the continued progress flights, the resupply flights, the autonomous unmanned vehicles that bring aboard water, consumables, spares, logistics capabilities. If, for whatever reason, and I think this is an important point that Congressman Gordon raised, that succession of flights is not achievable, then the idea of leaving them there for a sustained period of time without the capacity to support them is something we would have to consider seriously as a basis upon saying, time to dim the lights and come on back. And again, that's a decision we'd make as a partnership among the 16 nations involved. And there's a reticence, deep reticence, to want to leave that unmanned for any period of time because of the uncertainties of what could occur when there's no individual aboard. But it nonetheless is something I think we have to look at as an active consideration to recognize what the challenge and risk is of continuing this activity. I think you hit the nail right on the head.
You also talked about taking a stepping stone approach in this budget, and the orbital space plane is talked about or addressed in the budget, and the space station is addressed. I assume those are some of the stepping stones that to which you refer, and I'm curious as to how the shuttle investigation may impact those stepping stones. What effect could that investigation have on any of the overall plan or budget?
It is pure speculation on my part to determine what it is Admiral Gaiman and his board may or may not come up with. It would be a wild guess. And I have no idea exactly what the contents of that potential set of recommendations could be. Nonetheless, I think it's important that we position ourselves to look at what shuttle modernization, maintenance, upgrade, and continued operations requirements we would have. We're going to convene in March, as a matter of fact, with a group of folks that all look at every possible upgrade approach. that we had planned this prior to February 1st to get together to think about what it's going to take to extend the service life or maintain the service life of this asset through the next decade potentially. On the orbital space plane, again, there's a set of options we're looking at and have to examine in terms of what adjustments to the schedule might be possible as we work through this. Continuing discussions with our partners in terms of what it would take to continue or accelerate the number of progress flights, the number of Soyuz flights that would increase the crew capacity aboard International Station. All those certainly are on the table and under consideration. And as those recommendations come out, we'll figure out which options to proceed with, so we're not starting from scratch on the day that everything arrives as a report at that time. So we're going to try to be as agile as we can in responding to it, because our objective is to return to safe flight as quickly as we can.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Gutnick, the distinguished Vice Chairman of the Science Committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Keefe, thanks for coming here today. These are difficult times. I want to throw out a couple of ideas, issues, and I'd like to have you respond to them. Then I have a very specific question. Shortly after the disaster, there was a professor, I believe from Maryland, and I'm sorry I did not write down his name, but he raised a very troubling question for me. And he asked the question, I think, to the audience, what have we really learned in the last 5 years with all of the money that we've spent that we would not have learned here on Earth? And I think that's a question that NASA is going to have to help us answer. I mean, we've grown a lot of crystals out there, and we've done a lot of experiments, and I know that even some high school students from my hometown have done some experiments. But at the end of the day, it seems to me those are very, very expensive experiments, and I think we have to account to the taxpayers in terms of what we have actually learned in the last 5 years. The second point that I think is important, and this all causes us to sort of rethink what we're doing and why, and that is the difference between using human beings in space, manned space flights, and robotics. That's been referred to earlier. Now, obviously, when we start doing these deep space probes, we're going to have to use robots because human beings could not survive the trip. I think in terms of cost versus benefits, I think we need to take a very sober analysis as we go forward, because the one thing we have learned, two things we have learned in the last month, painful lessons. First of all, putting human beings into space is extremely expensive. And the second is traveling at 16 times the speed of sound is extremely dangerous. And so as we go forward, I think we have an obligation to answer those kinds of questions to our constituents. And finally, a very specific question, as was mentioned by my colleague from Florida, he and I are among the few, I think, on this committee who also serve on the Budget Committee. And we're currently trying to squeeze about $2.5 trillion worth of requests into about a $2.2 trillion budget. And that is not going to be easy. And so in terms of the budget side of it, I want to ask very specifically, part of this committee's responsibility, as part of our responsibility, we must have complete information and records of funding requests from your agency. Will you provide, for the record, all of NASA's submittals to OMB and the OMB budget guidance and direction to NASA for the Space Shuttle program and any related accounts since 1997?
Well, let me see if I can respond to each of the 3 points you've raised here. First one is, what have we done? Just this last night, matter of fact, I happened to see a package that impressed me to no end that responds to this question in a way I hadn't thought of. In the last 7 years, over 1,500 journal articles have appeared that are exclusively owing to human spaceflight research. And there's a specific activity or comment that was made by Dr. Michael DeBakey, who is the world-renowned heart surgeon, who says the human spaceflight research studies have produced knowledge of tremendous importance that has been of use and practical use in a number of different areas that would not have been possible were it not for these achievements. And he has developed a new heart pump, for example, that he attributes directly to what research was attained as a result of the human spaceflight experiences we've had just in the last 5 years. So there are lots of others, and I'll provide those for the record that would summarize.
Mr. O'Keefe, I think it's good that you provide them for the record and for this committee. But it seems to me that one of the functions that NASA probably is going to have to do a better job of in the coming years is explaining to the American taxpayers, you know, what exactly are they getting in return? Now, we know that in the early days we got enormous returns in terms of computer technology, telecommunications, a whole lot of areas that were expanded geometrically because of the space agency. In recent years, though, we don't see that kind of real benefit to the average consumer, and so it's important you share it with us. But I think it's even more important now that you share it with the American people.
Point very well taken, Congressman. I'll positively redouble the efforts to work that through. You've got an excellent point. Second issue you raise is humans versus not kind of approach to what we do. Again, I think it's not an either or. It's how they complement each other. And a statistic I saw just the other day that basically translates to about $20 per American is what we spend for human spaceflight activities. That's what it ultimately costs in terms of the amount of dedication of tax resources or resource efforts towards that. We've got to determine whether that's too high or not. There's no doubt about it. And make an assertion of more importantly, rather than its expense, is the horrific risk that we run by humans being involved. And again, I think that's a case where in the course of human exploration, had we not exercised, or had we exercised extreme caution in every case, the Wright brothers 100 years ago wouldn't have never done what they did, and we wouldn't be in air travel today. So, you know, we've got to look at this in context, but it's an important one, and I think you raise a seriously important question that we have to do some deep soul searching about. The last issue of what did we submit and where have we been? We're going through the audit trail now, trying to resurrect all the data and information, working with our colleagues within the administration to ascertain how to respond to that. I'll get back to you very shortly on that question. We're working through exactly what the administration will provide in that context by coordinating with that. We're trying to gather the data now.
Our staff will follow up with you. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Well, there's some good news from the briefing from Secretary Ridge on Homeland Security. The Homeland Terrorism Alert has been downgraded from code orange to code yellow. The briefing is ongoing, and as you might suspect, it's dealing with some very important subject matter. But at least there's some good news to put on the table. I understand, Mr. Administrator, that in my absence there was a little bit of excitement generated in an exchange with Mr. Weiner. I understand in his enthusiasm he went a little far in comparing this to the Challenger situation. There were experts in that case who were clearly saying NASA should not launch this vehicle. Here we have the much more ambiguous situation of engineers speculating about a wide variety of possible problems that they themselves characterize as unlikely but worth considering. And it's not clear at all what the remedy might be. I'm not suggesting that these emails weren't important or shouldn't be heeded. I am suggesting that we need to avoid simplistic comparisons, and we need to investigate how the email traffic from this mission may have differed from that of other missions. And as the Administrator has said, we need to look hard at whether judgment calls were being made at the appropriate level in the agency with the appropriate amount of information. I think it's a little bit premature to do any finger pointing at this stage. We're all searching for the same sometimes elusive facts. So, Mr. O'Keefe, do you feel at this point that any of the released emails should have been seen by you at the time they were written?
Again, that would be an extraordinary volume. And given the circumstances of my limited intellectual capacity, I'm not sure I could have digested all that I've seen just in the course of the last 3 weeks during the course of operations. Again, everybody's expected to step up in these cases during an operational activity, and it appears for all the world that that exchange was going on. And exactly the right kind of scenario analysis and simulation of cases does not appear to have been something that was a lingering question. There was resolution to each of these points. And again, that's exactly the right kind of commentary that ought to be going on. As it pertains to the spirited exchange, in your absence or while you were here, I can assure you every exchange has been spirited, and I've enjoyed every one of them, sir.
Well, let me ask you, what was the highest level which the emails were reviewed, and are you convinced, in looking back, and hindsight is always 20/20, that it was the appropriate level for decision-making?
That's a good question. On this particular circumstance, which again narrowly deals with the scenario and the simulation of the question of what do you do on landing with one flat tire or two flat tires, as I understand the nature of the exchange, and what could lead to these problems leading up to that landing. That was vetted all the way through to the point of some very senior folks at Langley as well as at Johnson. It was at the Mission Operation Directorate level that was specific activity engaged in, and at one point even raised, I think, to the center director at Langley Research Center. And I was just down at Langley 2 days ago to discuss with all of our colleagues there how we're working through the investigation, and did have an opportunity to exchange a bit with some of the folks who were engaged in this particular dialogue as it pertains to the landing options that might have otherwise occurred. And they were all of a mind that indeed that discussion that was going on was exactly the kind of discussion that goes on for every kind of mission, and it's the nature of the same debate, and that it was resolved at the appropriate levels. I want to reserve on that question until I see the Gaiman recommendations as to whether or not that was the appropriate level to deal with. And I really I got to look at this very, very carefully. But in this particular case, the folks who participated were pretty senior at lots of levels within the two centers that were engaged in the activity, and were aware of the activities that were going on, and were making judgments about what they thought the preponderance of evidence would suggest as a safety of flight consideration. That's, we can argue with the nature of the judgment and whether it should have been different or not, but the question of whether it was iterated and resolved as they worked through it, the benefit of a lot of knowledge was exchanged. That's very, very clear.
So at this point, you feel that the appropriate level did deal with the emails, and that they should not have come to the administrator at the time. It was not necessary in view of all the other responsibilities.
Indeed. But again, I'll be guided by the Gaiman Board's view of exactly what is the appropriate call in those circumstances. But it sure appears as though the right discussions at the right levels and resolving it at the right circumstances were engaged, and that indeed the resolution was no safety of flight consideration. And that was what was reported up the chain throughout the course of the operation on several different occasions, of having done their jobs and worked through it professionally, diligently, and accountably. They've reached conclusions based on the preponderance of evidence of what compromise to safety of flight would be involved, and so advised everyone throughout that chain. Again, as we work through this, to the extent there is a different systemic challenge or management problem that would be identified, I'm going to be guided by the Gaiman Board's view of that question.
Thank you very much, and as we all will be, and that's why I think it's particularly important that we continue to emphasize the independent nature of the Gaiman Commission.
Indeed.
In that regard, let me turn now to Ms. Woolsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. O'Keefe. I believe through this process since the tragedy that you've played a great role in helping our country and our nation through this tragedy, and with a lack of defensiveness that I really respect.
Thank you very much.
But you know what? We're in a new place right now with this email, and I think there are questions the public want answered. I don't think that we can pacify them now that they've read what the staff was questioning. And I can say just for myself that supporting the NASA budget's going to depend on feeling absolutely sure that we've gotten real answers to those questions that were asked and that came out of that email. I mean, I think that, could the shuttle crew have survived had they known ahead of time that maybe they should abort the mission and come back before that area of concern was stressed through the entire mission?
Sure.
And could they have, I don't know the answers to these. I wouldn't even begin to know, but I know if I don't, the public doesn't, and they want to know these things. Could the crew have been able to repair the area at the space station or something? Could the crew have prepared to escape upon return if they'd known in time? The public has to know this, and they want to know it before, and I want to know it before we authorize another budget.
Absolutely. There's no question. We really have to work through this and be responsive. We will be accountable. We will be absolutely honest about what we think of the assessments here, and any mistakes or judgment calls made as we work through this is what will be guided by the Gaming Board's recommendations and findings in those cases. So there's no question. In this particular case, and again, this is a one aspect of many, many, many different correspondences that went on during the course of operations and everything that led up to it, dealt very specifically with the issue of whether the orbiter could land on a flat tire or not, or two flat tires, or without the gear being up or down. That's the kind of debate and discussion we want to see go on. We want to encourage and want to keep folks feeling like they can do in the course of this. And my I think commitment in this particular case to all of our colleagues around the agency is that's precisely the kind of discussion that needs to go on, and we will indeed be accountable for that answer. Could they have responded to something? Well, to the extent that there is, again, it was a determination made that a safety of flight consideration was supported by the evidence involved and judgment calls made that said here was the problem. The crew would have been advised, any number of different scenarios would have been activated, but the fact of the matter is, on all of the 4,000 onboard sensors on Columbia, none of them indicated that there was a problem in this particular area. And until 8:52 that morning, no failure was detected. So as a consequence, a lot of scenarios and what-ifs were going on, but no evidence to support that by a sensor suggesting a problem or anything else. Now, as the information is certainly coming out at this juncture, as we're continuing to make sure we look at every single scrap of anything, we will be accountable for that. We will indeed find out what the cause was, driven by their findings, and we will make corrections to assure that within the limits of human frailty, this never happens again.
Well, okay, I appreciate that, because the public is more interested in what action was or was not taken, what prevention in the future versus participation. We need to know that.
Yes,
okay.
ma'am.
Now I want to go off on another subject, and the subject is who's going to be our workers in the future for the space program with everybody aging. I know our chairman has legislation and to shore up our workforce, but one with the aging population of your workers, and two with the challenge of what's just happened, and possibly people won't be coming to NASA to go to work. What are you doing about that?
Well, thank you.
Is it a problem?
It is. It is an issue that we are most concerned about, and indeed, this is a maturing workforce. I am 47 years old. I am the average age of the agency.
Your baby.
I know I look a lot older than that, but that's the age. But as a consequence, it is a real challenge when you look at and you really shred the information of what the maturity level, if you will, of the workforce is at this juncture. It is we have 3 times as many folks who are scientists, engineers, and technologists who are over 60 as we have under 30. And so as a consequence, the better part of a quarter, approaching a third of our workforce will be eligible to retire in the next 5 years. Last June, we submitted to the Congress, the President initiated legislation to look at a whole range of personnel authorities that take the best practices that have been enacted by Congress and implemented by agencies of the federal government in the last decade, and utilizing each of those best practices to give those authorities to NASA to recruit, retain, and to continue to develop the opportunities for engineering, scientific, and technology-related fields to encourage to come to NASA. Every opportunity we have, and that's one of the reasons education is a dominant part of our mission objectives now, to inspire that next generation of explorers that we've just adopted as a way to look at this, is to really go out there and actively encourage interest in what we do. And there's no question the interest level is high. We need to get about the business of not only recruiting but also retaining and bringing in mid-level entry of folks within other experiences. All of those opportunities the chairman has very impressively sponsored as part of his effort to help us move forward, get those tools, and be able to deal with what I think is a looming set of issues that we're not there yet, but we certainly have an opportunity to shape and affect that outcome in the years ahead if we do this diligently, and the chairman's sponsorship has been most helpful.
Right.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Director, I know that we focused a great deal on the shuttle here, but still, it's a 30-year-old design, flying people in the back of what are in effect ballistic missiles, a 40-year-old concept. in your budget request, you request $550 million for this coming year on the orbital space plane concept. And if you could answer the following questions in whatever order you choose to, what do we as the U.S. government and American taxpayers get for that $550 million this year? If this effort is successful, and I hope it would be, how long before we'll have an operational orbital space plane? What would the total cost be when we get to that point? And will it be, maybe the science for a single stage is not achievable. Will it be a single stage, a two-stage, or is it still going to require those ballistic missiles?
Okay. For $550 million in this coming year, as well as in each successive year hereafter, what it primarily covers is the cost of technology demonstration of the X-37 right now, which is under development and in production. There's a physical asset that you can go put your hands on in Palmdale, California, that the Boeing folks are working on, that is a technology demonstrator of the maneuverability characteristics we seek in the orbital space plane. What is the next stage in this, and what part of that $550 million covers as well, is the cost to design and select a specific set of characteristics and work through all those requirements on the part of several contractors, so that the ultimate objective we select is not just a tech demo, but an operational asset. And so that's partly what that covers as well. When operational, the current plan is we seek to do that by the end of this decade. Part of what's been a dialogue here today is as our efforts in working with the Orbital Space Plane Program and the Aeronautics Technologies enterprise within NASA to see if we can find differing schedules to accelerate, potentially look at what it would take in order to produce that particular asset sooner. Total cost, don't know until we select what the competitive design is. There are at least 3 or 4 different approaches that could be used. Some have wings, some don't. There's all kinds of different methods that contractors are looking at and will be looking to respond to that will then give us the answer to that cost. But before we make that decision, the Congress will know what that cost estimate is of the general parameters of a view where we go before we make a contract award. And that's partly what I think Congressman Rohrabacher was referring to a little bit earlier in terms of when are we going to get to a stage of understanding that. And the answer to that is within the next 12 to 18 months of selecting what design you'd ultimately select to go that route, and that'll give a cost number. Will it be single or multiple stage? The initial idea is to launch it off an expendable vehicle. So yes, indeed. It is not a reusable launch vehicle asset that would not use chemical propellant. That's no question. It's going to be still tethered to the exciting 8.5 minutes it takes to get into low Earth orbit that is very typical of the way we have done business in the past. And there's no doubt about it. It's tethered to that because the objective of the orbital space plane is primarily to test its maneuverability, its durability features, its flexibility on orbit. The next generation launch technologies approach that we've also included and is funded or proposed, subject to your approval, is an approach to look at what it would take to get out of the expendable launch vehicle business and start looking at reusable launch vehicles that can launch and land just like aircraft do. That's a ways away. We tried to go down that road a few years ago, I'm advised, with the X-33 program, and found that it required a suspension of the laws of physics in order to accomplish the task. We don't know how to do it yet. So we're trying to beat each of these technical obstacles one at a time in order to achieve that ultimate objective down the road.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Metz.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. O'Keefe, for giving us so much time today. I just have a couple of questions I want to run past you. Representative Woolsey raised the issue about workforce issues and within NASA, and I guess another component of that would be among your suppliers. For example, with the Space Shuttle operations being suspended for the time being, there are many suppliers, such as American Pacific, that produces the aluminum perchlorate for the shuttle solid rocket motors. And there's a question if they're going to be able to sustain their workforce during this period of suspension of operation. It's my understanding they're the only supplier of this material within the United States. Has NASA been able to give some thought to if there anything to address these companies that may be facing these layoffs that may be part of your critical supply chain and issues we can do to make sure we don't run into problems with that?
Sure. As a matter of fact, this is one of several, and I appreciate your point, that we are faced with a very limited supply because, you know, it's not a large-scale, you know, production run of anything that we are engaged in. And throughout NASA, we aren't a manufacturing house. I mean, there's single digits of anything. We don't do anything by volume. And as a consequence, it is a singular standalone set of programs each and every time. The objective we really got to look at for the industrial base is to try to identify where those long poles in a tent are, for example, of supplier requirements. We're just beginning to get down that road to look at what that may be, but we again remain very optimistic that if we can find, and if the findings are released by the independent gaming board here in the time ahead, that we can determine what those corrections are, get back to safe flight, and only when we are assured that those operational corrections are sufficient to guarantee within the limits of human frailty our ability to get back to safe flight. I'm very optimistic we can still attain that. To the extent we can't, again, the industrial base issues we've got to look to, we're being guided by the 4 primary spaceflight centers to look at what those initial requirements are that may be perishable in those cases. And so we're starting down that road now to start thinking about what those are, including the very case you raised as well.
I'm glad to hear that because I do think that's just an issue that deserves some good attention. One more question. I know you've talked about this a lot today, but just real quick, I know last November the Integrated Space Transportation Plan that NASA laid out in its budget amendment for the FY03 NASA budget, it outlined an approach to ensuring the country has human access to space in the near term with what was going to be, number 1, a safer and more efficient space shuttle, number 2, an orbital space plane to support the space station, and number 3, a long-term plan for developing a revolutionary launch system for the future with next-generation launch technology and with that program. So the question I'd ask you is, at this point, do you interpret that is the orbital space plane intended to be a complement to the shuttle by giving alternative crew access to and from the space station, or is it intended to replace the shuttle? And secondly, is the orbital space plane going to be using existing technologies, or is it going to require continued development of new technologies? And if so, what's your sense of, is it going to delay development over a period of time, potential delays? Just wondering how you see those programs meshing with each other in the near term.
Sure. Well, thank you for a very important question. I think we've really done a lot of soul searching leading to this proposal that was submitted first, as you correctly cite, as part of the November budget amendment that the President submitted, and now reaffirmed as part of our fiscal year 04 proposal that the President has submitted along with the 04 budget. And that is, indeed, it is a complement to the Space Shuttle effort, specifically as a way to think about how we can do dynamic, very flexible, extremely maneuverable crew transfer requirements that would bring folks back and forth to International Space Station as again, flexibly as we can, because among the things that Shuttle is, being flexible and dynamic in terms of its ability to launch on near no notice is not one of its characteristics. It takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of effort, and indeed 30 days before launch, you've got to roll out the orbiter, make sure everything checks out. It goes through an exhaustive effort. It is not a flexible asset in that regard. So using it as a remarkable cargo and asset carrying capability, given the fact that it is the payload bay, is what we need in order to continue building the International Space Station. We can't do it, as has been pointed out here in today's discussion. Can't do it any other way. There is no other asset we have in order to launch and bring to Space Station the components, the modules, the capabilities, the laboratory capabilities for science and research in any other method. So we've got to have that capability to carry that. But in terms of a crew capability, the orbital space plane can easily supplement for that purpose, so we can devolve more towards cargo transportation requirements for shuttle and more for crew transfer requirements for the orbital space plane. The aspect that we're looking to, and again, it was in part the discussion with Mr. Lucas here a moment ago, is we're looking to identify a couple of technical limits that we currently have to live with, which is maneuverability and the capacity to launch on a little more of a near notice that would give us some more dynamic flexibility in scheduling. Those are the kinds of things we seek to overcome with the orbital space plane. So rather than trying to look at a whole range of different technical limitations, we're trying to narrow it to a couple and achieve maneuverability purposes in order to get some flexibility in the asset. So it has some power generation capability, which the shuttle currently does not while it's on orbit, to any really great degree of adjusting its capabilities, and to have a capacity in order to assure transfer back and forth on as immediate a notice as we possibly can to assure the safety of not only the crew aboard, but also on International Space Station. So we're trying to narrow those purposes so we're not trying to have an asset that does all things for all people. Instead, you beat those technical limits one at a time and do it in a very disciplined way.
Thank you. The gentleman's time is expired.
Well, thank you, Congressman. Appreciate the thoughtful questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. O'Keefe, thank you for your patience and candor in responding to these very important questions. The committee has some concern over aeronautic R&D funding cuts. You know, the administration's FY04 budget request for NASA's Aeronautics Technology Program is $959 million. Once a core program within NASA, the administration plans to cut funding for this program by 5% over the next 5 years, and this just sort of exacerbates a 10-year period of cuts. Today, NASA is only spending half of what it expended in 1998 for aeronautics, and these needs were highlighted in the final report of the Commission on the Future of the United States Aerospace Industry, a congressionally created commission chaired by former Science Committee Chairman Bob Walker. And this report concluded, as we approach the 100th anniversary of powered flight, the Commission urges the President and Congress to recognize a pressing national need and powerful opportunity and act now to create a 21st century air transportation system. The House Science Committee plans 2 hearings and legislation on these aeronautic R&D issues over the next couple of months. Now I've got 3 questions pertaining to that. Given the Aerospace Commission's findings, what is the explanation for cutting aeronautics funding? The second question, what is NASA going to do to implement the recommendations of the Aerospace Commission? And finally, Mr. O'Keefe, how do you view NASA's role to aid the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, and U.S. industry to develop the next generation modernized air traffic system and technology for quiet aircraft?
Sure. Thank you very much for those questions. As it pertains to the Commission's findings, you're absolutely right. Their view is that we need to look at a robust aeronautics capability. In fiscal year 04, $959 million is what has been proposed. For the out years thereafter, that has a relationship to the last question you raised, which is we are currently working with Marion Blakey at the Federal Aviation Administration and the Department of Transportation and the Defense Department to look at how we might look at not only quiet aircraft technology but also airspace management efforts, the security and safety kinds of issues on aeronautics and aviation. And so trying to wrap all those together, and I safely predict that we'll be making adjustments to those out years before they are actually presented to you for consideration for an annual appropriation. So at this juncture, that's a baseline, if you will. It goes nowhere but adjusted after we complete these efforts with the FAA and the Department of Transportation. And again, I take the findings and recommendations of the Walker Commission very seriously, and ones that we want to now reconcile relative to programs and plans on airspace management, aviation security and safety, and quiet aircraft technology, to look at those in coordination with Defense, DOT, FAA particularly, and that Marion Blakey and I are working together very closely to develop as part of the 05 budget submission on what that may take.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Congressman.
Mr. Miller.
Sorry, I'm new here. Thank you, Mr. O'Keefe. There have been several questions today about our return on investment, whether space exploration, human space travel, or other space exploration is really worth it. I support human space travel and space exploration for its own sake. I still feel an open-mouthed wonder at the idea of space exploration, and I quickly become 49 going on 9 when I think of human space travel. But when I am forced to offer grown-up reasons for supporting space exploration. They are what you offered a few minutes ago and what Dr. DeBakey offered, and that is we have developed technologies that have practical commercial applications, unintended but happy results from research for another purpose. Is that still a purpose, a part of NASA's mission?
Absolutely, yes, sir. Let me give you another example of what's in this budget now for your consideration is the Human Research Initiative that I talked about in the opening statement is the better part of about $400 million worth of effort dedicated to trying to determine the challenges to human endurance in space flight. Now, two of the challenges that we confront on every expedition mission on International Space Station is a degeneration of muscle mass and bone loss. And it's an accelerated degeneration. It's one that is roughly on the order of 30% muscle mass loss over a span of 4 to 6 months on orbit is what most astronauts experience on International Space Station for that duration, long-duration space flight, and they lose up to 10% of bone mass loss. So it's a very accelerated degeneration effort. If we could figure out how to arrest that, its applications for the rest of us earthbound folks is rather dramatic.
Right.
Because it would avoid challenges with osteoporosis, hip replacements, you name it. If we can figure out how to deal with this on a much more gradual basis on Earth, we could apply those same principles, and as an imperative to do so, to arrest the rapid degeneration that occurs on most astronauts there. So that's just one example of the kinds of breakthroughs I think that will help long-term duration spaceflight necessary for any exploration objectives, but also has an immediate near-term benefit to the millions of us here who, regrettably, as a consequence of aging, will encounter these kinds of challenges. And if we can find out solutions to that, they have help and application to us here.
I have some questions specifically about commercial applications of NASA's technology and research. Mr. O'Keefe, about how much does NASA now get from licensing agreements for technologies that have been the result of a commercial application from NASA's research?
Oh, I don't know. Let me provide that for the record. I just flat don't know the answer to that.
Okay. In your 04 budget, NASA's proposed budget, there is a new program called Enterprise Engine. Could you describe what that program is, what its purpose is, how it works?
Yes, let me search my mind here. The objective there is to look at new engine technologies that is being, I believe, in this particular case, is being conducted at the Glenn Research Center in Cleveland, Ohio. Part of the effort is looking at a range of different fuel cell capabilities and others. I'm sorry, am I not responding to the question right?
I don't think that's the purpose. It's.
I apologize. Let me answer for the record then, because I don't know then.
All right.
I thought it was that, but if I got it wrong.
I don't understand. I'm sincerely asking questions to get information, but actually what you've just said is contrary to all the information I'd gotten before about what Enterprise Engine is.
I freely confess that it is likely that I got it wrong. All right, so let me provide it for the record, not wing it. Yeah, I got a note that says it is a commercialization effort. That is about as illuminating as mud. You know, I mean, I don't know. But I don't know, and let me not wing it. I've got it wrong, and I will provide it for the record.
I probably ought to direct the rest of my questions to this fellow sitting right over here.
That's what he gets for sending notes up. So you can have that one back.
All right. The budget for 04 also terminates.
I would be delighted to let him sit here and let me leave. Excuse me, Congressman.
The budget also terminates all the funding for the commercial technology program. How will you do that instead?
Well, there is not all of it. There is the aspects of the commercial technology transfer that are uniquely can only be carried out by NASA are the things we're continuing. There's a couple of efforts on a national technology tech transfer center and a few other things that are still retained there. What we're also looking to is to utilize the capacity on the part of industry, universities, others to pick up that tech transfer, because in a lot of ways the last thing we are is really competent at figuring out what commercial applications could come from something. Industry is good at that, universities are good at that, and so part of our task ought to be to make that information available to figure out how they can then apply it, rather than us, the government, public sector, trying to anticipate how you can use something for a commercial application. We are singularly unqualified to do that kind of activity. So we're trying to look to industry and universities to partner with us to assume that role in a more dynamic way.
Gentleman's time has expired. Thank you very much. Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me as well, Mr. Administrator, add certainly our community's appreciation to NASA in the aftermath, and particularly the attention given to the families, and as I know, the attention still given to the families. I think whatever we do in this session of Congress that relates to NASA should be in tribute and respect to their enormous loss.
Yes, ma'am.
And to the sacrifice that was made by those who lost their life. I might want to mention General Howell, who is our administrator or our director at NASA Johnson. Particularly want to compliment him and his staff for what they continue to do. Pointedly, let me just ask a question, barring the reflection of the budget. Does this administration have any immediate perspective or in the future plans to scrap the human space shuttle?
No.
I think it is important because the rumors abound, and even though there is a projected budget, you're telling me that the President does not intend to eliminate the human space shuttle.
Absolutely not.
With that in mind, let me focus on what I think is enormously important. I have noted that you have listened, and NASA has expanded the investigatory board, the accident board that is reviewing. But I believe expansion would require some additional consideration that would bring some enhanced diversity and sensitivity to those who have been astronauts. And in keeping with that spirit, I would suggest to you that it could be expanded. Dr. Bernard Harris is part of our community, and we're well aware of retired Marine General Bolden, who you have great respect for, and I would like to converse with you on that point about how we can ensure that we are reaching out and bring a number of sensitivities to the table that I think might be important. I want to pursue very briefly the question of the email, but not so much. That's going to be part of the investigation. It saddens us, but we need to find out the facts. But what I do want to pursue is the question of the enormous amount issues that I've raised of privatization that have occurred over the years that we've come to acknowledge. I expect to call all of the corporations that have now taken up responsibilities that we used to have as NASA staff, government staff, into my office and ask them about their training, how long their employees have been in place, and I would ask the chairman to consider that as a hearing, to have the questions asked about the engineers, how long they've been in place, what do they know, what do they not know. What is your assessment of the impact of privatization and the tenure of staff on the safety questions that we're now dealing with and the tragedy that we're now dealing with? And let me just follow up so that you can have the time to answer, to be able to ask the question dealing with crew survivability. I think we have been lacking in that kind of research, and I'd like to know what we can do to provide funding focused specifically on crew survivability. I think we have been lacking in the 17 years since Challenger, and now, of course, we face another challenge with respect to this particular tragedy that we faced over the last month. And I'd appreciate your answers.
Indeed, thank you very much. On the privatization consequences, or the fact that it is the activities for launch as well as on-orbit operational activities are conducted by contractors or individuals who are not United States government employees, the data would suggest over the course of the last decade that in the course of that time in which that transition's occurred, that the incident of on-launch or pre-launch anomalies as well as on-orbit deficiencies or problems, whatever else, have actually gone down. So the safety margins or capabilities have actually appeared to have improved during the course of that time based on the data. And again, we'll provide that for you in greater detail, but it is it just seems to be a pattern here that would suggest an improvement in those safety considerations in the course of that time. Nonetheless, something went wrong on this flight. Whether it's attributable to the safety factors or not is something we will learn from the Game and Board's findings. And if it is, that's what we're going to correct. but all the information would seem to suggest this is not as a consequence of transition one way or the other. Second point that I think is important in this area too is a difference of what appears to be, again, given my limited tenure of just a year and a month, is restricted to examination of the prior efforts, appears to be a transition from a quality control approach to a quality assurance approach. That is a modern, very contemporary transition that's occurred in lots of different things we do as human beings over the course of this last decade in lots of different enterprises and professional activities, which is to get away from the checkers checking the checkers to one in which we improve the process to assure that systemically there is a reduction of risk. And that's a more modern, contemporary management approach that seems to have paid dividends in this particular case. But again, we will be guided by the independent Columbia Accident Investigation Board's findings as to whether this may have been a contributing cause or not.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Ms. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the first time I've been invisible for in a long, long time. To be here all this time and everybody that came in after me get called on first. So I want to make sure the record reflects that I don't like it. And
Make sure the record also reflects that the majority gets the list from the minority, and we follow the list to the letter. There is no favoritism played in this committee. We try to be fair to all concerned.
The gentlelady
may proceed for 5 minutes.
Yeah. Thank you. This has nothing to do with the party. It has to do with whether or not staff is sufficient. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to file my statement for the opening and apologize for having another committee where I had to do the same thing before Cummins, but I did get here around 11 o'clock. Mr. O'Keefe, I appreciate you staying all this time and not losing your cool and all that. And then I have observed, because this was obviously very disturbing to someone whose family called me before it came on CNN to tell me about a boom down in Dallas. But there are a number of things that I have some concerns about. First, the obsolete equipment and parts, and the with this shuttle being in operation since 1981 and plan on being there until 2020, with the advances that technology and everything else has made in this complex system, it would seem to me that ought to give you some kind of indication it might have what. And then the computers have not been upgraded since only once, and that was 88 and 89. Now, maybe it's something about all this I don't understand, and I'd like some comments on it. The space exploration program research obviously has been one of the most successful in our nation with all of the products and services of which we've gotten. And it's costly. Most research is costly, but I think that it's certainly returned on the investment. But I want an explanation as to why the average person reading this would be shocked that something this important and this risky for human survival would have technology of which the research has been responsible for producing, and you have some of the most antiquated technology that I have heard of recently. It seemed to me that the shuttle just started falling apart, and it might be because of the age of it. And but I'd like you to comment on that.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much. I read some of the same articles as well, and I'm mystified because this characterizes an asset that I'm not familiar with. I mean, the shuttle orbiters go through a exhaustive effort every 8 to 10 flights called a orbiter major modification program. And as a consequence, that what's conducted in that is a virtual teardown of the entire asset every 8 to 10 flights, in which you bring it down to the bare airframe and then reassemble it to assure that all the systems are modernized and upgraded, and that the capabilities for upgrades are incorporated into each of the orbiters as they go through this process. So roughly every 4 years, you're seeing every one of these. There's always one orbiter in that process. Discovery is currently in that process. And what it'll come out as is not a brand new, but a close to restored condition asset that we can make it. Columbia had gone through a $160 million 24-month major modification effort. In late '01 is when it delivered. Its first flight was in March of '02. And unfortunately, STS-107 was its second flight after that OMM, but it was an upgraded asset just a little over a year before. So the capabilities and the equipment is as modern as it can be permitted to be. Now, that's the second point, is that one of the things that we don't want to do is test out new things on the the shuttle before we fully understand what the characteristics of failure might be. And so as a consequence, any upgrade that's incorporated here really has to be rigorously tested before we incorporate it into the shuttle program, because the last thing you need is an on-orbit failure, which is clearly what seemed to have happened here somewhere. Something happened, and we're going to find out what it was. But it wasn't for a lack of continually reviewing the testing involved and making sure that the systems are upgraded. Nonetheless, if the Columbia Accident Investigation Board and that independent board's view is that the age of the asset, the technology, whatever, is deficient, that's what's going to guide our future view of exactly what it's going to take to return to flight or not. So inasmuch as these trends may be something I look at and say, I'm not sure how to reconcile them, nonetheless, we're going to be guided in terms of what occurs here by that independent judgment of the Columbia Accident Investigation Board. And if that's one of their findings, that's what we're going to be dealing with and responding to.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your patience, and thank you, Mr. O'Keefe, as well, for endurance test here this morning. Let me add to the chorus of those who have expressed very thoughtful manner in which you have handled a very difficult situation, especially for the NASA family and to impacted astronauts and their families, and for the straightforward manner that you've held up during considerable questions from Congress. So having said that, let me cut right to the straightforward response I'm looking for, and I wish to associate myself with the questioning remarks of Mr. Representative Gingrey, because it's very disappointing to me as a person who's entirely supportive of the space program to see that the aeronautics portion of the budget gets cut again. The budget gets cut, it's orphaned, and if you really look at the R&D portion of that budget, and while we're projecting a 5% cut, when you look at the institutional costs that are involved in this, in reality, it's probably more in that for R&D. This is when we're facing European Vision 2020, when we're experiencing all kinds of problems with our aeronautical industry here in the country, and we seem to be able to find money within the NASA budget for other activities, but we're cutting out a core activity and mission of NASA. We have the Walker Commission, the President's Commission on the Future of Aerospace and Industry, coming forward with a report. And it just seems to me, especially like many people in this room, hailing from districts that focus on aeronautics, and given the current plight of that industry, that we really have to rectify this and turn this around. And otherwise, people like myself who are supportive of the space program are going to have to rank order our priorities in terms of where we think those dollars should go.
Yes, sir. No, I appreciate your comments and the sentiment as well. The budget before you for fiscal year '04 is $959 million, which is an increase modestly, very small, no question about it, from the prior year. The out-year funding, again, will be subject to each and every year examining what the annual proposal from the President will be. And as I offered to Mr. Gingrey earlier, I fully concede that this does not reflect the ongoing efforts we're engaged in right now with Marion Blakey, the administrator at the FAA, the Department of Transportation, and the Department of Defense to deal with specifically 4 major areas. Airspace management efforts that we've got underway, as well as safety and security for aviation considerations that we're trying to sort out, and the quiet aircraft technology approaches. This puts a modest down payment on that first step. I think if you consider this to be a baseline from which we then make adjustments based on how we coordinate this among, for the out.
In my opinion, it's totally inadequate, and when you consider the institutional costs, and when I look at how you broke it down in terms of aeronautics technology and institutional costs, then I don't know how you bridge that gap, and it appears to me that it's going to be much larger than the 5% that we're showing here. And I can only add that I'm very disappointed in that, and hope that the committee will take a hard look at that. And I know this is an interest of the chairman and others on the committee.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Keefe, one more question about the emails. One of the most significant aspects of the email seems to be the decision not to request the military to do a close inspection of the shuttle. This goes beyond the engineering debates about how to land in the event of a problem with the wheels that you had referred to earlier. Isn't a decision to cancel an inspection the kind of decision that the administrator might be expected to get involved in? And do you have any sense of how often NASA has requested that the military inspect the shuttle from the ground? And finally, how disturbed are you at this point, again allowing for 2020 vision, that the inspection request was canceled?
Yes, sir. Well, the overarching aspect of this that I've looked at over the course of the last 3.5 weeks is for any imagery that could have been available to us, the determination, I'm advised, was based on whether the quality of the imagery that we'd received in the past from those sources was sufficiently clear to make a determination of something as small as what could be the consequence in this case. So the determination was on all the imagery that we had received or had available to us, offers that were made for certain imagery that in the past did not give us that level of granularity necessary to make that choice, was the basis upon which those decisions were made. Again, how the Gaming Board examines this in their independent judgment as to whether we should have, could have, might have gotten a better degree of understanding of what happened here on orbit had we asked for more imagery, because we'd received a lot of it. And there was a variety of different things we're now getting an understanding of that we use from lots of different sources, Defense Department as well as FAA and others, that would give us a understanding of exactly what occurred on ascent, on descent, as well as the on-orbit requirements that were rendered. But in each case, the determination seems to be, and again, we've got to really look at this carefully, is that the level of imagery would not have been high enough to make a determination that everybody thought was necessary to attain that. Was that a judgment call that was an error? We'll find out. And we're going to, definitely, I'm sure that'll be an aspect of the Gaming Board's in review, and if their findings and recommendations guide us in that direction, that's the direction we're going to be going in. No
Once
question
again, with the advantage of hindsight, is that an example, perhaps, of the kind of decision that should be made at the highest level within NASA?
Could be. Could be. I think that is no question that the nature of whether or not these requests should be turned off or turned on ought to have been at a higher level than that.
But it was obviously the decision was made at a level where experienced,
yes,
very knowledgeable people were making. All right.
Who had received such imagery and data in the past. So again, there's their familiarity with the all-source information and its utility in these kinds of decisions is partly what you depend on their judgment and ask them as professionals to be responsible for, and they sound like they were. Having said that, again, the larger issue you've raised is one that I think is something we really need to think about, is exactly at what point do you make that decision if you think there's an anomaly that would justify that.
At this juncture, I have one final question, and then, as usual, we would afford the opportunity for all members to submit questions in writing, and we would hope and anticipate a prompt response, as prompt as possible under the circumstances. But NASA's Earth science programs are among its most useful contributions to research, and NASA contributes more funding than any other agency to climate change research. How does NASA coordinate its Earth science agenda with other federal agencies?
We are, as you correctly cite, we are the dominant asset provider, if you will, for the Climate Change Research Initiative. We work very, very closely in our Earth Science enterprise with our friends at NOAA, Department of Commerce, who have the lead responsibility for coordinating all federal assets in this regard. And we work with them very, very closely in using and trying to redirect our capabilities in earth science towards supporting that particular initiative. And it's a very close-knit relationship that we continue every day.
What role did you guys, let me rephrase that, what role did NASA play in formulating the draft strategic plan for climate change science?
We were a contributor. The primary lead role was taken again by the Department of Commerce at NOAA. And we were a contributor of responding to their inquiries in that regard. Certainly the White House and the Council on Environmental Quality and others were all part of that determination of what was there, but we were respondent to their requests for assets and information and capabilities. And the budget that you see before you includes the funding to accelerate that.
And how do you ensure that the needs of and instrumentation, as you're developing your instrumentation, that it is building for climate change science meets the needs of a broad range of scientists who are funded by a whole variety of federal agencies? I mean, everybody seems to be in the business these days.
Indeed. In more ways than one. There is, for the Earth Science enterprise, much like other activities we conduct, there is an advisory group of outside folks who are primarily universities and think tanks and so forth that are engaged in this, that help us look at the kinds of programs we need to use to respond to these kind of cases. Many of the folks who are participants there are also folks who contribute with other departments or agencies or whatever in dealing with some of the Earth science applications. And as a process of that, again, we are not setting requirements for that climate change research initiative. We are responding to their requests for how we go about providing not only the information but also the asset use for determining the data and information they think is relevant. And again, we're guided by an external group of folks who are within the guild, if you will, of the Earth science community of what is the most applicable and most useful capabilities they think will inform that debate in its broadest context.
Thank you. Mr. Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Ms. Johnson has asked for more time. I just want to briefly say first that I share your interest and the administrator's interest in considering legislation regarding NASA personnel, workforce legislation and rules, and the gentleman from Jefferson County is dropping a bill in today. I just hope that this year that we consider these changes in this committee, giving all of the members on both sides an opportunity to participate in these important decisions. And I yield the remaining 4 minutes and 45 seconds to Ms. Johnson.
Well, thank you, Congressman Hall. We would welcome your support and very much appreciate your willingness to do so. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hall. Mr. O'Keefe, the GAO placed the management of human capital as one of the greatest challenges to facing NASA, with decreases over the past decade from 25,000 fiscal year 93 to 18,000 fiscal year 2002. And the problem is likely to get worse since about 15% are eligible for retirement now. And in 5 years, 25% will be eligible for retirement. Give me some of the activities of which you're participating to remedy this for the future. And how are you including underrepresented groups?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for your...
And one other thing. What investments are being made at the university levels, most especially historically black colleges, to answer that?
Well, again, thank you for your very important question and very thoughtful, I think, analysis of what we share as a major problem. Last June, the President submitted to the Congress legislation specifically related to NASA to help recruit, retain, and work through the best practices of the federal government and apply them to NASA for workforce management and retention and new entrants. That last June, that legislation having been submitted, again, the chairman having called hearings on that question, we are very much looking forward to the Congress enacting those legislative proposals so we can move on with those new tools to do that. As it pertains to diversity objectives and the very important efforts we have with ongoing in colleges and universities, HBCUs particularly, one of the elements of that legislation was submitted is a scholarship for service program, which would give us an opportunity for HBCUs which are engaged in specific research and grant effort that we're supporting NASA research, that we have an opportunity first to recruit folks who are graduate assistants and participants in that important research endeavor to hopefully attract them to come to NASA to be part of our activity. So the Scholarship for Service legislative initiative, within that legislative package, we would love to see your support for that enactment of that provision so we can go out and look at how to recruit those folks. Last June, that legislation having been supported, we look for an early enactment of that activity so we can get on implementing that kind of an idea that would give us the opportunity to really make NASA professional and career opportunities available to grad students and undergraduates who are engaged in NASA research activity right now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Gordon.
Well, let me just conclude by thanking you, Mr. O'Keefe, for the time you've given us today. As usual, you represented yourself and NASA very well. And Chairman Bowler, thanks for a wide-open hearing that you had. I guess since I was going to just close out, but since it's been brought up, the rules changes, the workforce rules changes that you mentioned, and that you'd be reintroducing those. Let me ask you, the last time you did, several of those workforce rules went beyond NASA, and you were using this authorization to make changes government-wide. Would you expect to do that again, or would you limit your workforce rules just to your agency and the immediate jurisdiction of this committee?
Well, we would be pleased to implement whatever it is the Congress's will of enacting would permit us to do. Right now, we have none of those capabilities, none of those tools. So if you seek to limit them to our applications or someone else's, we'd be delighted to do it any way that Congress sees fit. The approach that's been taken is, I think Mr. Bollert has indicated his interest in introducing or developing legislation next week that he'd be introducing. Senator Voinovich on the other side, as I gather it, is having a hearing next week that he's asked me to appear to talk about it, and we're prepared to work with it, negotiate any variation, because right now we've got nothing.
Mr. Chairman, I haven't seen that yet, but I would hope that you would not take these applications government-wide and as were proposed last time, but rather try to keep them within the jurisdiction of this committee.
Yeah, it's always, staff just reassures me, it's always, from our vantage point, NASA-specific and not government-wide. But we'll be glad to continue to share the information with all concerned. Is there anyone else for the good of the order? Well, Mr. Administrator, I want to thank you very much for enduring this, for your good work, and we want to wish you the very best as you continue your very important responsibilities. And please pass on to all the members of the NASA family our deep appreciation for their hard work and dedication to finding the answers and looking back so we can prepare for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.